Hello, my name is Jesse Pence. Welcome to the code walkthrough for jQuery. I'm going to get into the intricacies of a code here in just a moment. If you want to skip ahead, there's no problem at all. I'm going to have chapters. It'll probably be right around here by the time I actually get into the code, because first I want to talk about what is jQuery and why did I make it. So first off, jQuery is a lightweight wrapper around the DOM API that offers the intuitive elegance of jQuery, but streamlined for the modern web. You can rekindle your love for method chaining now in a lightweight, type-safe package. It helps you seamlessly handle asynchronous tasks, customize error behaviors, and ensure your DOM operations always execute in order. And the best part is that the raw code is over 5 times smaller than jQuery after gzip, and the code after gzip is over 10 times smaller than jQuery after gzip.
Hello, it's Jesse from the future. I'm just here to correct myself. My math was bad there anyways. I don't want to talk about that. But I added about 500 bytes of stuff because I wanted to add some really cool features. I'll show off the cool features later, but I can't say anymore that it's 10 times smaller. It's only about 9 times smaller than jQuery. But we now have a scrawny little brother called Droxy, and that's only 2 kilobytes, and that bundle size, even without gzip, is only 4 kilobytes. And we'll talk more about the difference between jQuery and Droxy later. I'll be back in a minute. So, that's the thing, the DOM has progressed a lot since jQuery was created, but it's still really cool. It's still really handy for people to use. That's the thing, so what got me started with this? I've never really used jQuery that much. I like to use declarative frameworks. I love Solid Start, Astro, React if I have to. I love using declarative frameworks, but jQuery, it's interesting. I was wondering, because there was this tweet by the Primogen that said that no matter what cool tech your side projects use, just remember that over 22% of professionals still use jQuery. And this gentleman, Chris Van Houten, asked, honest question, I haven't used jQuery in several years because vanilla.js does everything I used it for. What are people using it for today? And Levels.io wrote, it's annoying to write document.getElementById, addEventListener, it's shorter to write $body.on click. That's delegation, and it's interesting that he doesn't know the difference, but still, I just wanted to point out that, he's using those 30 kilobytes of jQuery after gzip just because he's a little lazy, no offense to the guy, he's made millions of dollars, so I'm sure he's fine, but I just wanted to point out that, if you alias a single $sign to document.querySelector, and you alias a $$ to querySelectorAll, and you alias on to addEventListener, boom, you've got pretty much most of what you wanted with less, 30 kilobytes less in your bundle, and you can still be lazy. And then I even admitted, though, you don't get chaining whenever you do it just like this. And so David Gralwall pointed out, really cool of him to point this out, that you can just hack the element prototype and alias addEventListener to on. And then, I tried to do this thing, and it was pointless because I didn't understand what he was really saying in terms of chaining. I had to really get in there and play around with the code. And I still think prototypes might be the way to go here. But we'll talk about what I ended up doing, and I would love it if people would point out if they have any suggestions for what I should do with the code. My main idea was to keep the code small. I wanted to see what I could do at first under 2 kilobytes, but it wasn't quite enough. I wanted to replace everything you can do with jQuery with my library, and you'll see how I do it later. But first I want to talk about what is jQuery and why did people use it originally. He's saying he uses it now because he's lazy, and that's fine, but originally that wasn't exactly it. You had what I'm suggesting here, it's actually a little bit more like something called prototype.js, which came out with the Ruby on Rails community, and so they have this single $sign, and that was for document.getElementById. But then they also had a $, a $, I think it's right here, yep, and then this was for the CSS selectors. And then jQuery came out about a year later, February 2005 for prototype, and then August 2006 for jQuery. And jQuery just really hammered in on doing as much as you could with these CSS selectors, and then surrounding everything with that. And so prototype, it had these AJAX abstractions and stuff, but it's not remembered quite as much because jQuery just really wrapped everything behind this really handy wrapper of saying, okay, here's the CSS selector, let's do core.html. Let's, and just chaining things together. And then you also had this AJAX abstraction, because you have to remember, this is like over like 9 years before the Fetch API came out. I believe it was like 2015 when Fetch API came out. So like AJAX API, this was very, very handy, because XML HTTP request is not the easiest thing to use in the world. And especially back then, like nobody really knew how to use that kind of API. So whenever jQuery just wrapped this up behind their $sign and just let you use everything like this, people loved it, because what you have to remember is that almost everybody's still using an Internet Explorer at this point. Google Chrome doesn't come out until 2008. I was using Firefox. Firefox came out in like 2002. Like most people, like web dev type people, were using Firefox. I was just a nerd. But like the thing was, if you were actually a web dev, you had to worry about this stuff with like Safari or with Mozilla. Like every browser did things slightly differently, and so it was just so handy to use jQuery and just say, use the CSS selector and do this thing. And so you didn't have to worry about doing all of these special things to get your code to work in every browser. But the thing is, at this point, you might not need jQuery. jQuery and its cousins are great. You can use them by all means. But at this point in the post-IE8 era, browsers are pretty easy to deal with on their own. And I love this website. You might not need jQuery.com, because it points out everything. I did a lot of stuff a little bit differently, but I took some ideas from this for sure. And I like the fade in and fade out. I just use the web animations API, and I let you define your own animations, because I'll show you later. It's pretty easy to do on your own. But let's talk about like people who have tried to wrap these abstractions up. So what I suggested at the beginning was basically the same as this Bling.js, except he was smart enough to put it on the node prototype, because that helps you do all the chaining stuff and stuff like that. Really cool stuff with that. And you can do a lot with just that. And honestly, I think I might, like I said, I might end up changing the code to use prototypes, but I really liked what I ended up doing, and it's like maybe too clever. I would love for people to have suggestions. Rip me apart if this is dumb. This is the whole reason for this code walkthrough. It's to see, like, I did a lot of things naively, so I would love to know what I've done wrong. But then there were a lot of other good suggestions here in the comments. One of my favorites was this Bling Bling JS by Argyle Inc., where he does this object assign, and that way you can use it for like the node lists and stuff like that. Really cool stuff there. And one of the best overall is definitely Fabio Spampanato's cache. But the thing is with his is that minified and gzipped, it's still 6 kilobytes. And like I said, I wanted to see how much I could do with as little as possible. How much of the API could I cover? Originally, I wanted to stay under 2 kilobytes. I ended up going up to 3, but I think that it was worth some of the problems, because I ended up at like 2.2 kilobytes. And like everything I wanted to take out just made the library basically worthless comparatively, because I wanted to have an AJAX abstraction. I wanted to have some of that stuff that just built into the library. So, hey, it's me again. So that is the main difference with Droxy, is that it doesn't have any AJAX abstractions built in, and also you cannot switch the element context. So the main thing with Droxy is that you still have these, it's like something like, 25 or something like that, 25 methods at least. And with this, you can still use the do method and do any asynchronous thing that you want to do. It executes an asynchronous function, waits for it to resolve before continuing the chain. So like, you can await a fetch right in there, and you can do literally everything you need to do with AJAX with fetch. So that's the point of this library, and it's only 1.9 kilobytes. The main thing that you're missing here is like nice error handling, and there's no promisify helper. All you get is this bare metal way of like creating and selecting elements, and that's the main difference. I'll talk more about it at the very end. And so I will mention that, if you use my library and you think it sucks, just go use Cache. Cache is really the way to go. A lot of people are still using Zepto or jQuery Slim. Cache is awesome. Fabio Spampanato, incredible. He's always concerned with performance, one of the most performance-minded people on the web. And so if you have any concerns with my library and the performance it will provide, just go use Cache. And so moving on, let's talk about what jQuery is and how it's different from all of those other abstractions. functions, because what I wanted to offer was something that a lot of those things like Bling.js didn't necessarily offer, which is the ability to always execute your functions in order. That this chaining mechanism where you can say, wait, don't appear for a second, and then after that we're going to untoggle hidden, and then we can wait for all of these animations to finish. Each one's going to run in order, and you can predictably wait and rely on these things to work the same way every time. And then you can just say, especially something like this where you're removing each and every one of those elements from the DOM. I mean, this stuff, you'd have to do like go over the node list, do elements dot for each, and the idea is that this offers you that abstraction in just one method call. And so you get the reliable chaining that jQuery offered, the predictability of the methods firing one after the other. And so, like I said, it's so tiny that, you can just go ahead and use it from a CDN, but I went wild on these JS doc annotations and the types. So what you can do is you can just bring the index.tts into your project if you need to. I'm probably going to rework the way the types work because I'm not super happy with it. I'm happy with the type safety. It's pretty damn good. You'll see later. But I'm not happy with the way that you don't get the types whenever you bring it in with a CDN because it's so small. I'd love for people to be able to use this with a CDN and still get all those types and everything. So let's go over the rules. I love having some rules for the way the library works. And oh my God, I wrote way too much for this. It's an insane amount of words here. But I'm just going to go over it really quickly. Because, like I say right here, I wrote a lot, but the main idea is that everything should be predictable. You only need to read the bold parts unless you start doing a lot of crazy DOM manipulation, operating on multiple elements at once, using the same variables. That's the way you get into trouble with this, especially if you just won't make a new variable. So, you use a single $ function call to build a queue that operates on a single element, which we call a DomProxy. However, if you use a method like pick all or kid, you'll switch to a DomProxy collection, which works on multiple elements. So, if you use that $, then you're immediately going to get that DomProxy collection. But if you use a method like pick or parent and there's only one element in that collection, you're going to switch to a DomProxy. So every DomProxy is mutable, but I offer a fixed argument. So if you set that to true and you try to change the element with one of these methods, you're going to get an error. So that's why I say down here that all these custom methods can be chained together, and each method is going to be operating on the element held in the proxy at the time the function is called. If you switch context multiple times, it gets confusing. So if you want to pass in this fixed argument, go right ahead, or just remember to try to only switch element context once per variable. If you say that this variable is the parents of all of these elements, then you have that set in stone and you never change it again. So it's just up to you. I left the power in your hands to switch this element context as much as you want, but you can set this context to true, fix it in place with that argument to true. So all of these methods are setters that return the proxy. If you need to check the value of something, just use a DOM API directly. That's the idea, is that all of these have a different name. I didn't override the name of any of these DOM methods because I want you to still be able to use all the DOM APIs normally if you want to. If you don't want to write out these function calls, if you don't want to chain it, you can do that. But then you can also use those getters that those all offer. And you can do conditional checks with that in the middle of your chain. And I'll show you how to do that later. And so all the DOM APIs can be used, but they must come last within a single chain because all of these methods are returning the proxy. And so if you end the chain with something that's not a custom method, you're not going to be getting the proxy back. And so if that's the case, this is why I might change it back over to a prototype, but I kind of like this read-write segregation. It's kind of handy. All chains are begun in the order they are found in the script, but they await any microtasks or promises that are found before continuing. If you need to do things concurrently, you can make a new variable so you get a new queue. And so that's the thing. Each variable holds its own queue. It's every function runs sequentially within that variable. But if you make a new variable, then you can skip ahead in the queue because it's a whole different queue. You know what I mean? And so synchronous tasks are always executed as soon as possible. I'm not going to make you await that, because then, if you then you have to worry about awaiting promises everywhere you go. Everything's just awaited for you automatically, and then synchronous tasks automatically execute. You don't have to worry about what is a promise and what isn't a promise. Just pass your values into the functions, boom, it works. And so finally, you just need to remember that event handlers, if you use the same variable, each method is blocking. So if you have like a bunch of wait calls, especially like say wait 5 seconds, everything on that variable is going to wait 5 seconds. You can click on that button as much as you want, but it's got to wait for that wait call to finish. So this gives you like full predictability, as long as you remember that every variable is tied to a single queue that calls each function within the queue sequentially. It gives you full predictability as long as you use a new variable, especially like use a different variable for event handlers. That's the main thing you need to remember. You will never get in trouble as long as you use a new variable for each event handler. And so down here, I just wanted to say the demo and key concepts. We'll get into this a little bit later, but the magic sauce, as you may have heard me say, everything is a proxy. So you can still use the full DOM API for use cases and covered by one of the methods. And I also cover the node list with an array. So you can use array methods like map or filter to operate over the array, and then what you get returned, boom, it's going to be what you want. So that's the benefit of using the proxies, but there's definitely probably some performance overhead here. I'm really curious if this would scale well, and that's another reason why I'm thinking about changing it over to prototypes. But it's just, I love the flexibility these proxies give you, especially when you see how I use it in this code. It's wild. Okay, folks, I'm sorry to interrupt one more time, but a couple of the things that I said are no longer accurate with the way that the code stands today. There are going to be a few differences. Everything that you see, if there's any differences in the code, it's because what I'm saying is still true. The concepts are all still true, but I'm going to heavily edit this from now on, where anything where the code is dramatically different, I'm going to take it out entirely. Because for instance, I had a priority queue and I was using the event handlers and putting them into the priority queue and stuff like that. Like all of that was silly. I just need to let the event loop take care of that stuff by itself, because it'll take care of itself. And that even like took the code down a little bit so I could put in more crazy cool methods. And man, I have gone wild on these docs, and like they're so much better than when I was talking about them before. So I'm just gonna go through these examples the way they are now really quickly before we move into the code. So as we said, the single dollar sign is for basically a query selector, and the double dollar sign is basically query selector all. But then you can also like dynamically create elements on the fly and move them around the DOM as you please. And you can completely replace the elements that are held within those places in the DOM. Like as you want to operate on the DOM, you can use things like the HTML method. Usually it's going to be inner HTML, but if you pass the second argument as true, you're going to be working with outer HTML, and I pull a few weird tricks to hold on to the reference to that. So you can completely replace the element held by your reference, by the proxy, and then you can put something else entirely, a whole new HTML string inside of it with that. Or you can grab something from elsewhere in the DOM and move it in with the become method, which normally will, I believe it's set to clone by standard. I got to change that. I believe I changed that. Normally it'll just clone it over, so it won't pull the event handlers, but you can also move it over and be permanent. And so moveTo is going to be permanent as well, that method. But then you also have cloneTo, which is going to use clone node, which is just an incredible API. So cool. And then there's also like attach. And then, so all of these things are really, really handy, because you can set the mode to clone for like attach and pull stuff off from other parts of the DOM, or like with the mode to move, it's going to actually pull it over and it will still have the event handlers and stuff. So that's really handy. But one thing you need to remember is that you can change the elements held within the proxy, and then you can also change the proxy's reference to different elements. So you can use the same proxy to operate on different elements over time, and the reference can change. So this cool div proxy will no longer operate on the elements with the class cool div. So it's a little bit confusing working. So when in doubt, you can just use this refresh method that I added, and it resets the proxy to its original state. So you can see you can just move around the DOM and do as you please. So at first it's going to be in the first p tag, and it's going to say 1. Then it's going to move into the next p tag and say 2, and then it's going to move into the parent, which has all of these p tags. So the text content is 1, 2, 3, and then finally, if we refresh it, we'll be back inside, and the tag will be 1. So like I said earlier, you should only switch element context once per variable, but the refresh method allows you to move around and always know, as long as you call refresh at the end of your chain of operations, you're going to be back inside of the original element. And down here, I have the stuff about conditional logic. This is a recent addition to the library, but I really love what it allows you to do. It's so cool. I have these two methods, if and take while, and they allow you to conditionally execute functions on the way the elements stand in the middle of a chain. Because you know each method's going to operate in order, you can use these methods to do conditional things in the middle. And so the idea of if is that it's going to hold all the elements the same in the proxy. It's not going to affect the elements held within the proxy, but what it is going to do is it's going to conditionally execute functions on each of those elements in the proxy. And so with I have another method, do, which I'll talk about later, which operates on all of the elements at once, but then if is going to conditionally check each of those elements and then use the functions on each of them as in that way. And then take while will conditionally filter the elements held within the proxy. And so these are both based on these predicate functions. So you pass in something to it is for if, and if all the elements, if that particular element's text content is click me, it'll turn green. If it's not click me, it'll turn red. And then the cool thing is you can operate over time. So if it's been clicked and it changed in 1 second, you can see if it is now that. I mean, it's a silly idea, but it's just to show that it's going to actually be checking how that element is at that moment. And then with take while, like I said, you can filter what's held within the buttons. So you can take the buttons while their text content is not click me and turn them red, wait 1 second, and then turn them blue. And then after that, you can call refresh, and you're operating on all of the buttons again. And so that allows you to do a predicate function, move into the other things in the chain, and then come back out of the predicate function, and then be back in with all of the elements. I really should put a refresh here at the end. Oh, I do. Okay. It's important to remember that take while will alter the elements held within the proxy, and that any methods that follow it will only operate on the filtered elements. But we hold the reference to the original state, to the original variable that you put into the $ of a $$ call. For instance, here it is the class button. And so we can take while the text content is not click me, blah, 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 and then refresh, and now all the buttons will be blue. And so that case with that is that you can also reverse it, because it's going to be moving through the DOM, checking each element. So sometimes you're going to want to maybe be checking in the opposite direction. So you can check in either direction and move through each element in the DOM and do your predicate function this way. And that way you can do chains of operations in between. And the best thing about these chains is that all the promises are automatically awaited. You can create async functions and stick them right in the middle of your chains. There's no need to try catch anything. All methods are surrounded by the error handler. And so you can do anything you want for however long you want. And then if you use this do method, you're going to hold up the chain and do anything you want. You can do anything you want inside of a do method, and it will never move on with the chain until you finish your function here. You get past a reference to the element. You can do any of the methods that you would like in the chains inside, and then you can even just throw an arbitrary wait for 3 seconds. And what you don't want to do is put it onto the elements chain. You want to, because these methods are each going to await the promise in between. So what you want to do, and the event loop will move on. I can't control the event loop. I'm just playing with it. And so what you want to do is you want to, if you chain anything after this, that's fine, but you don't want to put any wait calls in here, because those timeouts are going to basically move the event loop on until we can get back to the timeout. And then we're awaiting the promise inside of it. So if there's a wait call here, it can be problematic with anything you do chaining after it. And so that's just something that you need to remember, but you can just await new promises like that. That's not a problem, because we're waiting for the function to complete, but we're not necessarily awaiting the chains inside of the function if they have timeouts. Really, it's just if you call the wait call, or if you do some transitions, some of the animations, I think that can be a little bit problematic if I remember right in my tests. But the wait method is the most problematic, but it's also so cool. And so down here we have the helper functions promisify and setErrorHandler. So the idea of these methods is that they can all take promises. So if one thing that we can do up here, you can see this fetch data gets handed into the text method with no await, no try catch, no problem. You can just pass these promises in. So what I can do to give you a helper method with this is give you promisify, which you can just make your own promises. That's not a problem. But I did these things where I can like cover these silly these usual use cases, and that also pass everything into the error handler for you, which you don't necessarily have direct access to. So promisify helps you with that, and you can centralize all your error handling with this function. So it's particularly useful for things like set timeout and set interval, especially, but any older APIs like XHR, HTTP request or something like that, you can always just return a promise yourself, and you can use the setErrorHandler function to customize the errors that you get from this. So what you can do is I put intervals into the promisify function. So if you pass an interval into this second argument, the meta argument, the only two things it expects are a timeout and an interval. The function we will not move forward into the chain. We will not move into this attach method until, this is a little problematic. This is a little problematic because we're putting it into the template string. And this function might get called, I don't think that technically works. I have better examples that I'm going to show you later. I'm glad I have that, because it's a very problematic, because it's going to, it's not going to await the promise. You're going to get handed a promise into the template function. What you need to do is pass a bare promise into the text method like this. You see, it's an async function, so it's going to return a promise. So that needs to be awaited, but we don't have to worry about it as long as you pass the function result directly into the text method. So good to get that out of the way early on, and you'll see how it works later. But like I said, the timeout's 10 seconds, so we won't move on because of the promisify method. And then the interval is 500 milliseconds. So it's going to keep trying. So it's going to try 20 times to pull this crappy API, as I put it, excuse my language. And so it's built into the promisify function, and it's going to try 20 times before we move into the attach method. And then down here, I have more about AJAX helpers, because that's part of what I wanted to do in terms of differentiating this. Like Droxy is 2 kilobytes even, but it doesn't have any of these helper functions that are really, really handy, like from JSON, from HTML, and even from Stream. This is what I use my extra, 700 kilobytes in the end, 700 bytes, excuse me, not kilobytes, Jesus. So this is what I use my extra 700 bytes that I ended up adding. I'm willing to go up to 4 kilobytes, especially because I have Droxy as a proof of concept, because you can use do and do whatever you need to. As you saw up here, like you can use do and it will hold up the chain, and Droxy has access to do, so you can use your async functions in there. But with jQuery, I just wanted to give all these helpers. Look at this. You get an automatic error message that you can customize,
Or you can pass in this onError method, which will run if there's an error, which you can use to send the error to analytics, or you can update the DOM with that. I'm thinking about making both run. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see how I feel about that. On success, though, this will run if the fetch is successful. On wait, will only run after 250 milliseconds on standard, but you can set it to 0 or you can set it to 1 second, and then this function will not run. But the timeout will be canceled when the fetch is successful. So you don't have to worry about this text changing after the fetch is successful. Everything is queued together correctly. And then down here, everything's sanitized by default, but you can turn it off. So if you're using your own trusted HTML and you want to run some scripts inside of it, I have these little helpers that if you set this to true and this to false, so you have to set two options. You have to really opt in, but you also have the full range of fetch options as well. So you can set your headers, set your body, and then down here I show you can chain things together if you want to make things confusing. And in this from JSON, it waits 5 seconds, and then it's going to call this from HTML, attach some HTML to it, and say we're going to replace this with a stream in 5 seconds, and then it fetches this stream, which recursively reads a stream and brings it in. And it can also be a server sent event. We can get into that later. And so down here, that covers all the GET requests and stuff, but what about puts and posts and stuff like that? Well, I have something that automatically serializes stuff in the DOM, and you can customize it as much as you want, and everything is optional. So you can just say, please send this big form. It's going to send this with form data by default. And I should have shown down here, all you have to do is pass in JSON true. And also, this is not going to prevent the default submission if that is the case. But I mean, if you're not in and on submit, if this is not a submit button, you're going to be fine. I mean, this is going to be the form itself, assumedly, if you're using ID big form. So this should assumedly be fine because you're just going to be using fetch behind the scenes. But if you're in the on-click event, you can pass in the event, and we're going to automatically prevent default submission. And then you can, it will try to use the action or a bunch of others I'll show you later, but you can also customize the URL, customize the body too. Usually it'll be trying to serialize the whole form, but you can just put in, I want to send this cool data if you hit this other submit button. And yeah, so there's all these methods and it's all documented, and almost all of this is in the JS docs that we'll talk about in a moment. And let's move into the code. Just kidding. I wanted to move this part where I talk about TypeScript to right before we actually get into the TypeScript part, so it'll be fresh in your mind. It's pretty short, don't worry. And so finally, TypeScript. Everything is fully type safe, but there's no way for the $ or $sign functions to infer the type of the element you're selecting unless it's a tag name. Things like $sign input will always be fully inferred, even if you're mapping over each of these individual inputs, because remember, this is a query selector all, so you're going to get an array from the node list of each input. In that case, each element would automatically become an HTML input element. So you can call things like check what the value is on it, and TypeScript's not going to complain because it's already type safe. But if you select a class or an ID, the type's going to be HTML element unless you specify it yourself. So just remember, you can just put the in between the $sign and the function call and just say whatever you need. The main time you'll ever need this really is input elements or like weird specialty elements like video and stuff like that. You know what I mean? All right, the best place to start looking at any NPM library is right here in the package.json. And as you can see, we just have these two exports in the exports field. We have a types declared in index.d.ts, and then the default export here in index.js. And so you might be thinking, oh, d.ts, this is built for me, right? No, this is hand built. I have every single thing in here. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've been using Copilot and ChatGPT to help me with it, but they are kind of useless sometimes. And so if you look on the DomProxy and we scroll down, you can see that we will have links to every single other thing. And if we go ahead and go over here and hover over it, you'll see that they all have long, long descriptions. But the thing is, it's actually not internally type safe. And
the thing is, I'm okay with this personally because it's only 600 lines of code and I am very, very declarative with all of my function names. I mean, I feel like it's really easy to read, but that's what every developer thinks. So let me know what you think. I don't know. I might add some JS docs to this eventually. And well, I might as well finish talking about the types while I'm at it because it helps you understand the general structure anyways. So as you can see here, we have the DomProxy, which has a generic that extends HTML element. And by default, it is an HTML element, which takes that generic and then extends it with all of these extra methods, as you can see here. And that way I can just lean on TypeScript knowing that you're working with HTML elements, a single element with DomProxy. And then the problem with this is that I have to explain what everything is twice because I'm sending it back with each thing, right? So depending on what the method is on what kind of thing you're working with, it's going to be sending something different back. And then even if you are using this and perhaps you use pick all, what you're almost certainly going to be getting back is a DomProxy collection of that type. And then down here for the DomProxy collection, I explain what everything is again because it's all subtly different if you're working on a type that is in an array of that type. And so once again, we have the HTML element here. And so above all else, I was prioritizing the user experience because even though I didn't necessarily use any types myself and this is not type safe and I couldn't lean on TypeScript to help me that much. I still have it checking my JavaScript, but there's only so much that it can do. And so I was able to stay flexible though. TypeScript's not yelling at me. I'm not seeing red squigglies. Those red squigglies really get to me. But the thing is, whenever I am working with this in user land, I do want it to be incredibly type safe. I want those red squigglies to mean something when I get them. And so here, as you can see, if we iterate over this array of inputs, it's going to know that each single one is an HTML input element. But if it's a class, then it can't infer that. It doesn't quite understand how that works. And so what you have to do is just right in between here is put that these are all HTML input elements. I know better than you, TypeScript. They're HTML input elements. And once again, it's completely type safe all the way through. But if this was a single $, you can't map over that. That's going to be an issue already up there. It doesn't know what's going on in here. And so we would have to get rid of that because we're just working on a single HTML input element. And then each of the methods inside of that are going to be referring to a single HTML input element. And so if we look at, I don't know why it's not responding. There we go. TypeScript was being rude to me for a second, probably because I'm recording. If we look in here, you can see that I have these extensive JS docs for everything. And so let's go over to val. And so we can see you can do value. That's going to be fine because we can do all of the DOM APIs, but we also have this val method, which sets the val of a DOM element based on its type for form elements. It works, it works for selects. You can do multi-selects. It works for all of that stuff. And so that is how the TypeScript works. And then I'm just going to point out a few more things over here in the index.d.ts. If we go in here and we scroll all the way past it, it's over 1,000 lines. It's insane, I know. If we go down here, you can see that what I'm doing for these $signs is that I am seeing if you are doing a string or you're passing in an HTML element. We'll talk about how that works later. And so the way that magic works in terms of working for all of the input elements automatically is we're just using this element for tag helper. And as you can see, we are just using the native HTML element tag name map. And we're just saying that if it is that thing, then that is what the DomProxy is. We're passing the string through into the helper, which is looking inside of that map to see if it matches anything. And that's the most complex TypeScript thing I have ever done. Moving on. All right, let's get into the actual code. I'm going to try my best to keep everything as big as possible from this point on. Sorry, I forget about it a couple times, but all the new stuff is going to be huge. So here we are in core.js. And before we get into the real code, I just want to talk really quickly about my guiding principles here. Number one has been making everything as small as possible, and that means reducing code duplication to the maximum, which has meant making all kinds of crazy higher order functions that I can combine together to have different results. So that has been my main guiding idea here, is just to make as many common functions that I can use in different ways. And so also my other guiding principle here has been that I do want to draw some ideas from jQuery, but for the most part, I am not trying to replace jQuery at all. To be fair, like, I just don't think it has much purpose at this point in the world to be trying to do exactly what jQuery does whenever you are you saw me talking about it if you watched the introduction, but the main principle here has been having a kind of asynchronous chain, a queue of operations that you always know is going to happen the same way every single time, have some error handling built into it, and have the chaining and the easy DOM manipulation. Those are the guiding principles, and doing it in as little code as possible. So here we are in core.js. And so the exposed interface is mostly through these two functions, which is the single $sign and the double $sign. But this is going to be the theme that you're going to keep seeing as we keep moving through this code, is that, the actual things that are exposed to the user are not always going to be very explanatory, because I'm just trying to get everything combined together into that one interface that they can use. So single $sign and double $sign both call createProxy, and it's just about what type that we are sending in to this getDOMElement function. We're going to go over this later. I want to really establish the queue first, but we use this getDOMElement function a lot, and that's what allows us to just put arbitrary strings of HTML in several different places, but it also allows us to use elements and node lists and arrays of all of the above. And so here we see that we are just trying to define the all option that we are passing into getDOMElement with the selector passed in. And so what we are doing is the selector gets passed to getDOMElement with the type defining what all is, and the fixed argument, if you choose it, it's going to be set to false by default, because like I said, all DOM proxies are mutable by default, but we just keep passing this argument through into each of these functions until it makes it into addMethods, where it's going to affect the way that the context switching methods work, and it's going to basically disable almost like 10 of the methods, 10 to 15 of the methods. And so right here, you can see that we have this createProxy function, which uses getDOMElement, errorHandler, and addMethods. And so there's not much here to look at to explain anything, but we'll get back to getDOMElement to see how we create and acquire elements that are already in the DOM. And then errorHandler, that's going to be near the end, but we're going to see it keep popping up, and that we just funnel all of our errors into the central one function, which is very small actually. And then you'll see this give_context function several times. This just helps the errors, it helps you understand. You'll have the error stack trace. We always put an error almost always into this first argument, and that gives you a stack trace. And then the second argument is just going to tell you right here, it is helping you understand if it's a single $sign or a double $sign, it's telling you, no, you didn't, it's not even one of the methods. You didn't even find an element in the first place. No elements. And so let's move into createQueue. This is the heart of the library. This is how each variable gets its own queue, and we can move through each of them as we move through the event loop. And so we have this main queue. This is where almost everything is going to go. But we also have the deferred queue. And this is just to help you manage things like race conditions and things like that. So you can always defer something to the end of the internal event loop. And so here you can see we have this run queue function. And we are just going through this main queue and shifting off the first thing and running that function. It's super duper simple. I had something way more complex, but this is all you need the run queue function to do, is just cycle through this main queue, and then once we hit 0, we're going to exit out of the while loop, and we'll move down into this last if loop, which is just seeing if we have deferred anything. And so when the run queue function is running, we're not going to run anything into deferred queue until we hit main queue length is 0. And then finally we can run through everything in the deferred queue. And we await each argument there. You'll see what this means later, but just know that the main queue, this has already happened before we get there. Otherwise, we would do it there as well. And then down here, you can see we go to isRunningFalse. So we have this isRunning boolean. This is just to make sure. It's one of our several safeguards that we have. There's so many built in that are just made to make sure that we do not move to the next function in the next method call until the previous method call finishes, no matter what. And so that's the main goal of this library, is to give you predictability in your asynchronous functions. And so down here we have the addToQueue function. And what this does is it just pushes something into the main queue onto the very end, and it makes sure that the main queue is running. So it's going to keep trying to run the run queue function, but if it's already running, then it's just going to hit a false. Right? So no matter what, if we call a method, it's going to run the queue, because it might have hit false before, but the only reason we would want to run the queue is if we add another method. So the last method called will always still run in the end, especially whenever we use defer, which will not run if it is running, but it will run the queue if not. And then finally, those are the two things that we return from the createQueue function. Moving down, we have the way that we interface with the createQueue function, which is this queueAndReturn factory function. It's a factory function that creates a higher order function, which we wrap around each of our internal methods. And we use an addToQueue function, which is going to be different for each internal variable. And then we're going to use that addToQueue function that we create in the createQueue function, and we're going to pass in an async anonymous function where we try to await each argument. We'll see it in just a second. And if we have any errors in the arguments, we're going to catch those with the error handler right here. And then we return getProxy. And so what this means is that the arguments are going to be what we're passing into the methods. And so if we pass in anything where it's an async function and there's an error, boom, it is caught by the error handler. And the getProxy function is a very simple function that returns the current representation of the proxy. So we never have a stale proxy. When we move into each function, it's going to get the current representation of the proxy and not what it was when the function was initially added to the queue. And this is the way that we make sure that we're always operating on a fresh DOM element, no matter what. And then down here we have the handlerMaker. And this is how our proxies are going to work. So with a proxy, we're going to pass in the element and whatever custom methods that we want to pass in, right? Those are going to be what we have in here in the second argument and the elements of the first argument. And when we create the handler that we pass into the proxy, it's going to do this every time we interact with the proxy. And it's going to be trying to see what we're trying to get from the proxy. So if there's only one element in the proxy, then you are going to be interfacing with that one element from no matter what. Because the first thing we do anytime you try to interact with the element is see how many elements are in the array. This keeps us from having to repetitively check in every function, whether it's an array or not. We just have a central check in the proxy handler. And so if there's only one element, then from that point on, you are operating on that element. And so we kind of trick TypeScript into knowing this in one way based on what your first call is and from there on, but it's kind of an inexact science because it can change depending on your context switches over time. And then down here, if you need to see the actual elements that are inside of it and you actually need to interact with those, you can interact with the raw property. And so if you have a $sign, this is going to be an array of a node list. And if it's a single $sign, it's just going to be that element. And then down here, it is how we actually run the custom methods. So once we have checked and made sure we are operating on one element or an array of elements, and we're making sure that you're not trying to just get the raw element itself, then we pass through whatever custom method you're trying to call. And then down here, finally, we allow you to use things like getAttribute, setAttribute, and also all of the array methods, because we've already checked if we should be operating on the array or not. So this is how we get access to all of the DOM APIs and then also all of the array methods, just by checking to see if that prop on the element is a function, and we already saw if it's an array or not up here. We can then bind the current this of the element or elements there to the function at the very end. And if nothing else, we're just going to return that prop, because this is how you're going to be able to check things like the style prop or like data prop, any of those attributes. You can check the ID. You don't have to use the getAttribute method, but that is available as well. And so that is handlerMaker. Let's move into eachArgument. So this is how we await each argument in every method call. So we have the function and the arguments passed into the function. And then we have this eager equals true. This is only for the if method. So right here we have eager equals true, and so we check and we see if anything is venable. If it's promise or even promise-like, then we're going to try to await it unless we have set eager to false. Then we just pass it through, because we want if to operate on the element as it stands when the if method is called. It's a little weird, but that only applies to if, so don't worry about it. Normally we're awaiting every single argument. Otherwise, we just pass through the argument if it's not venable, and then that allows us to do things that are synchronous. So yeah, and then here we have the result is the function of the resolved arguments, and if it isn't venable, we await the result. And this is just another double check to see if there's any promises before we move on. So in core.js, we have the $sign of a $sign, which we pass into createProxy, which is how we get our DOM element, and then we add methods to it. And we use this createQueue function, which has a main queue and a deferred queue. Almost everything is going to get passed through into the main queue by using this addToQueue function, which we pass into our queueAndReturn factory function, which is going to get our most recent elements and return them so we can have the most current proxy. And so the defer method here is only for, the defer function is only for the defer method, and you'll see how it's used soon. And then down here we have the handlerMaker, which is how we create the proxy. And then finally we have await each argument, the function each argument, which is how we await each argument. We'll move into methods.js and see how this is all used in a moment. All right, next up we have the addMethods function. So as you can see, this takes in almost all of the other functions defined throughout the rest of the library, and it centrally defines the behavior of each of the methods, and it holds the idea of what the original target was within the closure.
Now, is this the best for memory management over time, holding everything inside of this closure? I really don't know. I would love for people to critique this. Let me know what I should be doing instead. But what I'm doing is creating this addMethods function, and it holds everything inside of a closure. So this is how we can create the queue inside of a closure, and we're going to have this value over time, and we can pass this queue function that we create with the queueAndReturn function, and we can create a new factory function called makeMethod, which passes that queue function that we created from the queueAndReturn factory function into each of these methods, and we use that to queue each method when it is called, and then we capture the arguments right here, and then we await any and all promises that we find as a result of calling that function on the arguments with the element as the first argument. So you can see the element is passed in as the first argument in each of these methods down here. And then we give context with each of the methods, so we don't have to keep defining it. It is very repetitive. I would love for somebody to tell me a better way to do this, because we're just passing through the method name into each of these. And then so every error is going to have this context of which selector the addMethods function was called on, and also it will have the context of which method was called on that proxy. So we pass through the function and the context into the queue function so we pass through the function and the context, which contains the method and the selector it was called on, into the giveContext function, and we pass that into the queue function factory function, which is passed into the makeMethod factory function, which was created with these local addToQueue and defer functions. makeMethod is created with the local addToQueue function, which was created from the createQueue function. And then we have this queue function, which was created from queueAndReturn. So let's go back into core.js and think about how this all works. We have back here in core.js the local queue that we create with createQueue, and it gives us an addToQueue function that we then pass into this queueAndReturn function, which also takes in the most recent version of the proxy. And it uses addToQueue, and it awaits each argument and passes anything into the error handler if it needs to. Right? And we are taking the function and the context, and this eager argument is very rarely passed through. And then back over here in methods, we're taking that queueAndReturn, creating the queue function, and passing it through into makeMethod to give error context and await each argument for every single function, and we pass it into the queue. So we have this factory function, which uses a factory function made by a factory function. All of them create this higher order function, which is able to encapsulate all of that behavior into this local queues method, makeMethod function. And so every time you call this on function, it's going to capture the element you're calling it on and the arguments that you pass in to the function, right? So now that we have an idea of how addMethods interacts with the queue, let's move into the individual methods. All right, so we're going to start off with the event listener methods, on, once, delegate, and off, because these are the simplest way to see how we use the makeMethod function to queue up this function, and we capture the arguments. So we have makeMethod, and for on, we're just going to take the element as the first argument, and then we have the event and the function that we want to associate with that event on the element. And so up here, we're going to map over the array. If we have called it with a $, that's what the target will be, an array of nodes, or the target will be an array with a single node. We just make everything into an array so that we can just map over that and then call the action on the element with those arguments, the event and the function. And with the giveContext method here, we pass through that we are calling the on method on whatever selector that we passed through into the single or double dollar sign, and thus we can tell what we are doing in where we are in the chain. And so there we have it. We have on and once, which add the event listener. Once, make sure it only fires once. Down here, we have delegate, and as you can see, it's so simple and easy to delegate an event listener. You just add it to the original element and then see if the event's target matches whatever selector you pass in. So here, what you pass in to delegate is going to be the event, the selector, and whatever function you are delegating to that selector. And so then down here we have off, which is how you remove an event listener from each of the elements held in the array held within the proxy at that time. And so, yeah, that's just the simplest way to see how all of these methods work. And we are going to move into some of the more complicated stuff as we keep moving on. But as you'll see, it all just builds on the central concept of queuing up the method call and then encapsulating the action so that we know how we can map over the target and call that method with the target at that time that the method is called, what is held within it, the actual elements. Phrase that poorly, but hopefully you understood that. Next, let's move into HTML, text, and sanitize. So next up we have HTML, text, and sanitize. And so these are all about manipulating the elements held within the proxy, and you're going to be manipulating each element at a time, and it can be as simple as you can see with text as just manipulating the text content of each element. That's all that text does. It just keeps you from having to write text content equals. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit easier, and especially iterating over node lists, it's a lot faster and simpler. So that's all that text does, is it just manipulates the text content of each one. And originally I had it where HTML just replaced the inner HTML of each element. But then I thought about it, and I thought about how nice it would be to be able to replace the whole element of each thing. But it gets a lot harder to maintain your reference to that element, especially if you started with a query selector, because if you're using that, you're not going to be having the original elements that you selected anymore. And so you'll have an empty array if I'm not careful and I don't update the proxy. And so it really helps you to get this idea early on, though, too, because this is how we make sure that we have a fresh target and that we're always operating on the elements that we want to. Okay, so let's move down into update proxy really quickly before we move on. And you can see right here that we're just using that handlerMaker that we talked about in core.js, which is just checking to see if we should operate on one element or the whole array. And it is giving us access to these custom methods, and then it is giving us access to the DOM functions as well. And so it takes in the elements and the custom methods, as you can see here. And so with update proxy, we just pass in whatever the new target is. At the first point, we just pass in whatever target was passed into addMethods. But each time we call update proxy, like if you replace the entire outer HTML, you will call update proxy, which calls handlerMaker, which creates the proxy with the new target, or it creates the handler for the proxy with the new target. And then we pass that handler into the new proxy that we create with all the custom methods that we defined above. And then we put that raw property, we create the new raw property right there, and we set it to the new target. And then finally, we return the proxy. And so that is how you update the proxy, and that is your introduction to that. And the simplest way it can be is if you're replacing the entire HTML of each of the elements held within the proxy. And so the way that it works, if you pass through the second argument of true, if there's no second argument, we're just going to replace the inner element. If there's no second argument, we're just going to replace the inner HTML of each element. But if there is a second argument of true, we're calling it outer. And if outer exists, then we're going to use the outer HTML API, which replaces the entirety of the HTML held within that element, which makes it an entirely new element. So what we have to do is maintain a reference. So we look to see what the next sibling is in the DOM. And so we hold a reference to that, and then we change the outer HTML. But we want a reference to the new element so we can continue working on the proxy. So what we do is we check to see if the next sibling is null, then we're at the end of a list. So we can get the previous sibling from where we were, and it's going to be the new element, right? Otherwise, we get the last element child from the parent. So we check to see what the parent element is of the old element, and then we pass in the last element child, and that's going to be the new element. And so then we can change the target to be an array that only holds that new element. And then with that, we can say that we can update the proxy to that target. And that will then create the new proxy that we can operate from that point on. Sorry, we're about to move on, but I hope you understand the library well enough to see that there was a huge issue with the way that I was doing that before. I was creating a new proxy for each of the elements held within the array, which would be hugely wasteful when all we really want to do is update the target. So what I'm doing now is I'm just checking where we are in the array in the target, and so that's going to be the index, and we're going to say we're going to replace where we are in the array with this new element. And so I'm going to make this really real for you really quickly. And so first off, you can see that if we don't pass the second argument of true, it's just going to be the inner HTML. So we have this div with the ID of test, and we have these buttons here that say click me. We say that when we click it, we're going to iterate this count that we put up here, and then we're going to put that into the test divs HTML. So again, that'll be the inner HTML. We're only working on inner HTML here. And we're going to say we're going to wait 2 seconds before we put this span into the inner HTML, and then we're going to say change the color to red. 2 seconds is what I said, right? And so here we see, you can click it, it changes the div, and then 2 seconds later, it turns into hi. But the thing is, that is the inner HTML. So it's replacing click me, the text content, that is all that is the inner HTML. And now we are changing that into a span. But if we want to change the entire HTML of the element, we need to pass through this second argument of true. And then that is going to change the entire element into the span. So it will not be inside of a button anymore. But also, we are going to lose this event listener because these are tied to these buttons. So when the buttons are gone, so are the event listeners. So you'll see we can click on them for 2 seconds, but after that, even though right now we can click on these and they will still work, after those 2 seconds, those event listeners will be gone, but they will still change and be red because we'll still be able to work on the new references, right? So let's go ahead and we set it to true, and then here we go. And you can see that as we iterate through the list, we are changing each one. So the first time that we call this console log, it will be as we're working on the first element. And so this is why it was an issue before, because we were just changing the array into whatever element we were working on each time, and it was making a new proxy each time. So it was hugely wasteful, and it didn't work right. So now we are iterating through the array, checking the index each time, and changing that element into the new element. And as you can see, it no longer has the event listener that is there on the button. So we can change the div until that event listener is gone. All right, so let's move into sanitize. Sanitize, which uses the setHTML API. So let's talk about that really quickly. So this is where we start getting into the super experimental stuff here. But I mean, this is the future. It's going to be everywhere soon.
Firefox 119 to 121, it can be enabled by setting that flag to true. It's in the Safari technology preview. It seems to me like it's coming to all the browsers. So, like, creating a custom sanitizer is like, not very easy. Like, I would have to require a bunch of regex that I wouldn't fully understand or be able to maintain, and like, I can't pretend to be able to offer you a lot of security, but what I can offer you is an easy way to use this new API in the middle of a dependable chain. And so as of right now, it will only work if you're in Chromium browsers, but it will soon seemingly be available in all browsers. I mean, except IE 11. But the setHTML method, it's really, really, really cool. So it's what it does is it automatically sanitizes everything for you, but you can pass in the sanitizer constructor, and inside of this you can say what kind of elements you will allow, what kind of elements to block. It's actually really easy to use, a lot easier than you might think. So as you can see, sanitize is just a very thin wrapper around the setHTML API. And inner HTML already does a little bit of sanitization for you. You can see over here, this HTML call is just going to use inner HTML. And this is like one of the common ways of trying to sneak scripts around. It's just like putting the string around so that the interpreter can't see it. And as you can see, this does get interpolated the right way into the DOM, but it's just going to be ignored because inner HTML doesn't worry about stuff like that. So as you can see, it does get into the DOM, but it's just going to get ignored by the inner HTML call. But what does not get ignored is going to be these like inline event handlers like this, where they're just doing like an image with a fake source and then an on error where it's like, oh, we're XSSing you. And so as you can see, if we just put this into the DOM, we will see the alert. Bam, right there, because we had the error on that. So the on error event fired. And so this is what setHTML is here to help with, because it automatically takes care of stuff like that. And so if we put the sanitize instead, and we put the unsafe HTML in there, then whenever we go over here, you'll see we can load it in, and it will just ignore the on error handler. It has been sanitized out of the HTML. And so setHTML API is really cool. I'm not going to go into how to construct your own sanitizer, but it's actually really easy. You just like pass in arrays of stuff. Let's see, I think I have a good example here. You can see down here to create your own custom sanitizer. Like here, we're just saying you're going to allow spans, and that's it. Super easy to work with. Really cool. Okay, so next up we have val, which is the first method that requires a big helper function to operate correctly. And that's because with each element, the new value might operate on it differently depending on what kind of element it is. So we pass it through to make method to make sure we operate on each element, and we take that value and we see how we want to use that value on the element. So let's go over to DOM.js over here, and you can see the first thing here is set form element value. Great catchy name, I know. And you can see first we see if it's an input element. So normally we're just going to be using the value and setting the element's value to that if it's like a HTML, like a normal text box. But if it's a checkbox or a radio, that's going to be operating off of booleans, and it's going to be operating off of the element's checked attribute. And so if it's the checkbox, that's just going to be a normal true or false value. But radios, it can be multiple, and so we want to make sure that the elements checked includes each of those values. So with checkbox, it's just a normal true or false, but with radio, there can be multiple options. So you want to set the checked attribute to the correct option. So that's how that works. And so we just pick the correct handler depending on what type the input is, and then we run that handler to set the value. But if it's a multi-select, or a select at all, really, so we have to check if it's a select first, and then we're seeing if it's a multi-select, because if an array has been passed in, then we want to make sure that the elements options So next up we have select elements. And so this gets a little tricky if we're working with a multi-select. So we check the multiple attribute and we see if we're passing in an array as the value.
if that's the case, then we want to loop through each of the element's options, and we want to make sure that we set the selected attribute to be if the value includes the option dot value. And it gets a little tricky, but I mean, if you work with a multi-select, you know what these attributes mean. So it's a multiple sets it as a multi-select, and then we're looping through each of the element's options, and we're checking to see if the value, which is the array up here, includes that option's value. And then if it is, if the value is a string or a number, then we're assumedly just setting one select instead of a multi-select. And so we can just set that value to string, easy peasy. Down here, we just check to see if it's a text area or a button, and we're going to set that the value of the text area or the button to be the value. And then finally, if it's anything else and you're using the val method on it, I'm just assuming that it was a mistake and you meant to call text. And so I'm just going to set the text content. And so that's how the val method works. And I don't know, I could make a little experiment to show you how it works, but it would be pretty boring. Let's just move into CSS and addStyleSheet. So we have these two methods for styles. We have CSS, and you can see it takes in each element, a prop, and a value. And it passes it into this parse argument function. And you can see we're passing the first argument as l.style from each element, and then the prop and the value. So first let's go into the CSS method over here in the DOM. It uses parse argument. And so you can see that first argument in parse argument is the prop. And so in this case, the prop is the element's style prop here, right? And so then with that, we are checking to see if the next argument is a string or an object. And so if it's a string, then with CSS, we're just going to set that property style attribute to that value. And then if it's an object, then we're just going to use object.assign and then assign to that prop all of the things in the object that you pass in. And so that's a little bit abstract, but we'll get to that in a second. But right now, I just want to point out really quickly, notice that addStyleSheet does not take in the element. It just takes in some rules. So let's go into a little demo to see how this works. So we have this little playground that we're working with here, and we first define a count at 0, but we say it's a let so it can be changed. And up here you can see we have one button on the page, so we can just use the button selector here, and it's only going to operate on that. If we had multiple buttons, it would not operate on any other buttons unless we used a double $sign. And then down here we have this little on-click listener where we can just iterate the count and display it inside of the button. And then down here we have these CSS functions. And so in this first CSS method, we pass through a string as the first argument. So it's defined as the key, and the second argument is defined as the value. Whereas down here, we just use one argument, which is an object with a bunch of key value pairs inside of it. And that's how this works. So we can use both of these, and then it's going to work. And down here, we can see, but wait, how am I getting this hover right here? What's going on there? This is the reason for addStyleSheet, because if you know anything about working with the CSS OM, you'll know that you can't actually do these kind of pseudo properties unless it's actually in a real style sheet. So addStyleSheet, it's a little bit of a hack, I'll be the first to admit it. But what it does is it allows you to apply these pseudo element properties, which is almost impossible to do otherwise. And so if you can see here, we have this hover and we have this target, and it's applied to the button very, very easily in line. We can do stuff after it, like say, hey, in the text instead, and now the text is hey, as you can see. So everything operates sequentially. The addStyleSheet, let's take a look at that so you can see this hack. So what we're doing is we're just taking the rules and we're going to separate it every time we see a semicolon. That's how you have to write CSS anyways. And then we're just going to put important on each of those rules. So you should be like, very judicious in how you use this, but this is the
the only way that you can do this inline. As you can see, if I try to just apply the rules here, it's going to instead not do any of that. No hover, no nothing, because it's defining the inline rules as more important, and it's saying that, oh, you didn't define any background hover there. I'm going to just override that. I don't fully understand how that works. If we could make this work without that, I would love that. So I want to show you really quickly in this index.dts, I don't love the fact that I'm doing it this way, and so it adds a style sheet to the entire document. It's useful for things like hover styles. If you know how to make this scoped, let me know, because this should only be used when you need to set a pseudo class on the fly. Otherwise, use a real style sheet. If you have an idea for how to make this scoped, I was thinking about using the @scope rule, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I do tell you, everything's given an important flag. This is drastic. Don't use this unless you have to. And really quickly, I do want to talk about the CSS scope explainer, because it's really, really cool. So yeah, I'm just going to cut it to right here because I was rambling, but as you can see, you can just define inside of a style right there what your scope is going to be, and you're saying that it's this P down here making the color red, and then down here that's not red. So that would be perfect for this kind of library. And so I'm thinking about that's what I'm going to eventually do for addStyleSheet, but for right now it's this super duper hacky thing, but hey, it works. You know, if it works, it works, it works. Just make a real style sheet if you don't want to use important like this. I mean, that's what you should be doing, but you're trying to do things in line in a cool way like that. So that's why I have this. Okay, we should move through these next 7 pretty quickly because they're all pretty simple. They're just light wrappers around the DOM APIs, but they're just like really handy to have in the middle of a chain. We have these class functions that are just like light wrappers on top of the class list API. I just have this helper method to reduce me having to write this each time, where it's l.classlist for the type, and we spread in the classes if you are using them for that. So here we have the add class, the remove class, and toggle class. And so like this is not saving you really that much writing. It's just, you know, you don't write list. That's main thing that you don't write, and a period. But the deal with this is that, you know, you can do it in the middle of a chain. And so with these, it's the exact same where you can spread in an array. I'm already spreading an array, but you can spread an array into my spread array. And so what you can do is just separate them all by a comma, and then, or you can put them into an array and spread out that array into your argument. And then down here we have set, unset, and toggle. These are just wrappers around like, as you can see, we were putting this into the parse argument so that you can bring in an object and set multiple things at the same time. And then this is the only time we use the attr argument here. We're just seeing if we should use set attribute. This just gives you a little helper where what we can do is pass in the value as empty. And so this is what allows you to just put set disabled or set hidden. And here, let me show you really quickly in the playground. So let's say that every time that you click the button for some reason, you want to set it to hidden. You don't have to put a second argument there. It's immediately going to be an empty string. And what that does is it sets it to hidden immediately for you. And so sadly, you do need that empty string, and it only works if you put it through set attribute through my experience. And that's the whole reason why we have this extra part of the function here, where we're seeing if we're working on an attribute. And then the only other time that we use parse argument is whenever we're working with a data set. And so what that just means is that when you're working with a data set, you can do it either way. And what we're going to do is allow you to work with the data properties, and you can set one or multiple at a time. And so here now when we click, instead of it being hidden, you're going to see that we are actually setting on the button these new data properties where data truth is true, data lie is false, and data other is other. And so that's how all of these work. They're just light wrappers that give you a few conveniences that make it a little bit easier to work with data sets, attributes, and classes.
So you might have been thinking, wait, what about IDs? Well, IDs are just attributes. So you can use the set method, and with that you can just immediately set an ID to whatever you want it to be, and then immediately afterwards you can query for that ID. And then you can say, on click we're going to choose all the buttons. I made an extra button here, and now all of the buttons text will change. But we're only going to be setting the ID onto one of these elements. So even if I put pick everything with the ID of me, it's only going to pick this first button that we chose, but it's going to be changing the text of all of the buttons. So let's go over here to the playground, and you'll be able to see that we have this one button that changes the text of everything else. This does not have an event listener because we didn't use the $, but all we have to do would be to set the ID onto both of the elements, and now they both work the same way. And so that's one way to show how you can use both of these for different things. And then also this is the way to set IDs on elements. You can get into some crazy data race type situations if you try to do like something like even if you try to do like something like color in between here. I bet you this is going to be too much in between, because it's going to be running this function and then immediately running this function, and there's going to be a promise in between right here. So as you can see, bam, just putting that one thing in between is just enough to screw you over in this kind of situation. So you don't want to be trying to set these kind of like things like too often unless you know you can do it at the very top of the script by itself, but it is a possibility. But I mean, the obvious answer is like, what are you doing? Why is this a separate thing? Why don't you just do that and then everything works perfectly fine? So like I said, the only time you get into trouble in these situations is when you're doing weird, silly stuff. So that was just an introduction to some data array stuff. Let's keep moving. So next we're going to get into the more advanced DOM manipulation methods: attach, cloneTo, moveTo, and become. And these are just like, instead of having individual ones like append, prepend, before, after, insert, adjacent HTML, all of that silliness, instead it's just all hidden behind a position option that you can pass into one of these to decide how they will behave whenever you do it. So you have attach is the easiest way to understand this. So we're going to start off with attach. And so right here you can see that all we're doing is we're taking the element that you're trying to attach things to, and then we're looking at all of the other arguments. Assumedly, the majority of these arguments are going to be the children, but you can also pass through two options, whether or not you want to sanitize it or the position. And you can also pass through a sanitizer, a custom sanitizer. And we'll talk more about that in a second because I had to change things to accommodate that just now. So first, let's look at this modifyDOM function. So modifyDOM is going to be down here, and as you can see, we have some defaults for the options. Like my default position option is append, which is going to put it inside of the parent at the very end. But then you can also put it inside the parent at the very beginning, or outside of the parent at the very beginning, or outside of the parent at the very end. And really, this is everything you could possibly want to do, isn't it? Like, just choose a selector and say how you want to move this DOM element around or inside of this selector, because, otherwise just put another selector inside of something else. Like, these four options cover most of your use cases, and I'll explain them in a little bit more detail in a second. But down here we have get, clone, or node, which is just seeing if we are actually going to be taking the actual element or cloning the element with a deep clone, with the clone node API, which is just so handy, so great. And so we then take each of the children that have been passed into the modifyDOM function. So in attach, that's going to be all of the arguments except for the last one, which is your options argument. And then we take all of those children and we iterate through them, and we run the getDOMElement function, with the option of whether or not you want to sanitize it. And then we also want to pass in the sanitizer. This is why I had to change everything. This is a last minute change here. So, because I wanted you to be able to pass down a custom sanitizer into this, because I want you to be able to put arbitrary HTML strings into this, which means that, and everything can work asynchronously. So you can bring in a promise. You can go fetch some arbitrary HTML string, and you can decide how you want to put it around the element, and you can even choose how you want to sanitize it, because that's how this setHTML method works. You can pass in your own custom sanitizer, or it uses its standard sanitizer. So I just keep passing down whatever sanitizer you might have put in here, but then it's going to get put into setHTML right there. Let's talk about how this function actually works, the getDOMElement function and the createDOMFromString function, before we move any further and we talk about anything else. The getDOMElement function is looking to see what you are passing through as your item. And if the string starts with this less than symbol, after any, we cut out any blank space so you can put it on the next line or anything. Don't worry about that. But if it starts with that less than symbol, we're going to assume that you're passing in an HTML string. Because the thing is, you can use the text method if you want to just be putting in text content. So what else would you be starting your HTML with other than a less than symbol to say what tags you're putting in to your HTML? And so I know this is simple. I know it's naive, but why not? It works. It works great. So we pass that through into this createDOMFromString function if we see it starts with that. And all that does is it just creates a div, and inside of that div, we're just going to throw this div away. We just want to see what we're going to put for the HTML. We can either run the setHTML function with that custom sanitizer, or it's going to use its standard sanitizer on the string normally. Or we can use inner HTML on that, which is a little bit looser in terms of the security. And then we are just going to see what the children are inside of that div that we just created. And we create an array from that, and then boom, you have your node list that we can operate on. And so that's how the createDOMFromString function works. And so if we start with the less than symbol, we pass it through to the createDOMFromString function. Otherwise, we check to see if it's an HTML element. This seems to help with node lists too. I don't know how that works entirely, but it seems to work with both HTML elements and node lists. So we just put those into an array because we're set up. It's ready to go. Then we look to see if you have passed through that all option. If that's true, so like that's going to be based on if you have called the $$ over $$ or a couple of changes that might happen throughout the course when we are calling this function. So if that's true, then we're going to get query selector all and make an array from it. If it's false, then we just get a normal query selector and make an array from it. So it's just going to be that first thing that it finds with the query selector, or it's going to be all the things that it finds. Either way, it's wrapped in an array. And then you can see that that is how those work. So with attach, all we have to do is run that through modifyDOM. ModifyDOM is looking for any options that have been passed through, and then it runs the action that is appropriate for it on each parent with each child. Okay, so and it decides if it's going to clone it or not. So the easiest way to see how it works is with attach, but then we'll move into cloneTo and moveTo because it's very similar. Okay, so we're back here in our playground, and we got our two buttons here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go down to the bottom here, and we're going to put attach, and we can just do any HTML as we just saw. So I'm just going to put an HR, and this is going to append it to each of these elements. So if we go in, you can see it's after all of the content inside of the element.
And if we want to put it before all of the content inside of the element, we can just put this second argument right here, and we can just say position prepend it. And what that's going to do is it's going to put it at the very top before click me right here, but it's still inside of the button. So what you might not think about is that, whoops, we just replaced all of the HTML, my bad. So what we can do here instead is put it before each button. And so what that's going to do is it's going to put it up at the very top before each of the buttons. And so you can see it right there outside of the element. So that's going to remain after we click on it. And then if we want to put it at the very end after each element, we can do after. And so I feel like this covers like almost every single use case that you would have in terms of attaching. And so like this can also be something else, you know, like if you put in just div right here, it's going to be looking for the first div that it can find. So each one's going to get one of those two divs. And so that's how attach works. So let's move into cloneTo and moveTo, which are very similar. If you look, you can see that they both actually use the same function here, move or clone. And with move or clone, it's just going to be working very similar to attach, actually. It's just going to be going and trying to get each of these parents and getting the DOM elements for those. And then for each of those parents, it's going to be modifying the DOM with the children, which we're going to be creating, just double checking and making an array out of it and just flattening the array, if nothing else. And so what that allows us to do is that we can operate on each of these and move or clone them anywhere into the DOM that we want. So let's go back in here and we can say move these in. Each of these is going to move inside of one of the divs. I think that should work fine. And then this should separate the buttons and yep, bam. Oh, that makes more sense. So both the buttons moved inside of the first div right here. Yeah. And then if we wanted it to still be, let's put it before. So that's what the position argument allows you to do, is that if we did this before, both these buttons are going to be at the very top of the page here. Boom. And so the thing is we just move them. So if we wanted to clone them, we could do that as well. And now we're going to have 4 buttons on the page. Bam. Oh, that makes sense. The event listeners don't come along when you clone Node. I don't know why I expected the event listeners to come along. That makes so much sense. So yeah, we just cloned it there. But as I should know, when you do clone Node, the event listeners don't come along. So that's just something that you have to keep in mind. That's how cloning works, silly. But yeah, I've recovered from my embarrassment just to show you that we are passing through these options from move or clone down into modifyDOM, and in modifyDOM is where we're looking for the mode option to see if we should do that clone node or not. And then that is the difference between cloneTo and moveTo. It really could be the same method and you could pass through the option, but I mean, it's really a much different use case, especially for, you know, the event listeners, obviously. So one more thing before we move on. So you see how we're doing cloneTo, and we're cloning it to the first div that we find with position before. That's what we're saying here with this. We're taking all of the me buttons, which is all of the buttons, and we're cloning them to the first div that we find. And that's why we now have these buttons on the bottom. And then we're saying position before, so it's going before the first div that we find on the page. But what about this other div? If you wanted it to be in all of the divs, you also have a chance to do this all argument. And all you have to do is set this to true. And because this is just getting passed through, we are going to now have 6 buttons, and it's going before each of the divs. And that's the power of the cloneTo option with the all and the position. I mean, you can just do whatever you want really here. And here's the thing. Right now we're cloning both of the buttons to all of them, but we could also just clone the first button with the ID of me that we find to all of them, and then we're going to have it there. And then what we could also do is we could say that that we only want to clone that one to this one div. And now we're going to have 2 buttons. So you can see there's a lot of power in these options. And like the idea is that you just have these few really powerful methods and then the ability to pass in these options to decide how you want them to work, so you don't have to remember which one's which. And all 3 of them only have those 4 options, and you can do pretty much whatever you want to do with those, you know, like, except like, you know, you can't clone things and have the event listeners go with it. I'm sorry, it's just not possible. But otherwise, I mean, attach, cloneTo, and moveTo, and then between that and choosing the all option to get it to go through and get all the DOM elements that it can with this query selector all. So yeah, so that is how attach, cloneTo, and moveTo work. Let's move into become, which is a little bit different. So attach, cloneTo, and moveTo are just 3 different ways to call modifyDOM. Attach is letting you take the element and attach whatever children you want onto it, whereas moveTo or cloneTo are using the elements as children and then letting you define whatever parent you want to attach them to. But what if you want the element to stay exactly where it is, but to become something entirely different, usually from elsewhere in the DOM? But this gives you the power to let it become anything that you want it to be. And I'll show you how that works in just a second, but let's just walk through how the function works really quickly. You take the elements and the replacements, and then you can pass through these options. The standard mode is clone. So you're going to take the elements from elsewhere and clone them into the element that you're working with. So the way this works is we have this handle replacement function that's doing all of the work. If there's no replacement, we're just going to return silently and not worry about it. And then we're trying to make this new element. If the mode is clone, which is a standard, we're going to clone node, as we often do. Otherwise, we're going to take that replacement, because what we're doing is we're going to actually replace the element with that. This is our version of replace with. We're using the native replace with API, which was inspired by jQuery, like so much else of this. And so we have to do a bunch of annoying stuff here. This is all just to work with the proxy. This is the entire reason why the raw property exists, and then like iterating through it, if it's a node list, it's a whole deal. But this allows us to just pass in any instance of HTML elements, and it will become our new elements inside of our proxy. So we are just trying to make an array out of the elements that we have, which is what we are working with in the DOM, what we're calling the $sign on initially. And then we're trying to make replacements with the first argument that we're passing through into become. And that becomes our replacements array. And then we go through each of the elements that we're working with, and we use this handle replacement function on each of the elements and replace it with each of the replacement elements. And so let's talk about how this would actually work in detail. So here we have all of this stuff right here, and we have our normal button. Let's look at this. This first div has the ID of hey. So what we can do here is that we have our normal stuff here. We have our first button that is the only one that we're targeting right now. We're only targeting the one button. And we can say that we want this to become something from elsewhere in the DOM. So what we're going to do is we're going to call the become function, and we can now query for hey. And as we query for hey, it's going to take that div and it's going to be pushed into the proxy, and that's going to become our new proxy. And so now we will have 2 highs on the page. But, you know, we can also, we can use our createDOMFromString here. So it could be div ID, or I mean, I don't know, it doesn't really matter what the ID is. Let's just put hey yo in here. And so now that will become the new div there. And so that's why the become function exists. It's a little bit redundant, but it's our version of replace with, and it's just like a lot more. I mean, like, look, we can pass in a document query selector here if we wanted to, because it can take node lists as well. That's still going to work. I mean, become is just super duper flexible. Now, here is where the issue can be, because if we have 2 of these and then we have 2 of these, let's add another one in right here. And so here's the question. What do we want to happen here? Do we want both of the buttons to become the first one? Do we want to cycle through and have another high and another yo? What do we want to happen here? And so let's go ahead and save this and see what happens here. And you can see we get the first element twice. This right now is the only bug in jQuery. As you can see, we currently have one open issue, which says that currently when cloning another DomProxy or collection or node list, become only uses the first element found. And to clarify, cloneTo works perfectly for this situation. I just really want this to be so insanely flexible that you can call become here as well, and it will work. And I've got like paragraphs of explanation and a link to a good demo that explains what I expect to happen or what should happen. I don't even know. This is the only bug. Please, I would love it if you could help me figure this out. This has wrecked my brain. I spent like 6 hours trying to fix this and I couldn't really come up with a good solution. I kind of talk about it here a little bit. So please, if you have a good idea for how this should work whenever we're working with a node list with multiple things, and we're trying to say that multiple things should become that node list, I had something working where I was like cycling through. I don't want to talk about it. Let's just move on. So next up we have the purge method, and it's just a thin wrapper around the native remove method, which completely removes the elements from the DOM. The reason why it's a little bit handy to have something like this is especially if we are operating on multiple elements. So instead of having to iterate through this and call for each, and it would be document.querySelectorAll.forEach. Instead, we just do a $$ on the me and call purge, and they are removed from the DOM entirely. And so this is part of why I say that we don't really, I don't know, become works really well in a lot of situations, and if you really wanted to do something like where you want it to become multiple other elements in the DOM that you're querying like this is all you would have to do. So like it's very easily replaceable by doing something like that, and that's not that hard to do. So moving on, let's get to something a lot more exciting to talk about. We're going to talk about this send method. I need to set up a form. I'll be right back. So I like testing my stuff with live server just as I'm writing it, but as you can see right here, we have that running on port 5500, and then I'm going to have this node server over here on port 3000. So we're going to have to do this whole chorus, song and dance to allow port 5500 to come over here to port 3000, and we'll do the option stuff. And then down here is where we're going to actually have the data. So we are going to log at the very top what the method and the URL are. And then down here, we are just going to spit out that I'm the best, and this is what time it is. Otherwise, it's not found. So let's go ahead and we have this form over here. So let's go and look at this. And we have a very simple form here, ID my form, with an input with the ID of me, and the value of my title with the name of title, and then this text area with the name of body that has hello in it already, and then this button that's just the submit button. And so we're grabbing the submit button and that input that says me. And then down here, we're just going to also grab my form. Funnily enough, that's going to work because IDs are aliased, but let's go ahead and just grab it like that to make things less confusing. And so then we have my form right there, and we're going to say that when we click this, we're going to send my form. Now, what you're going to notice is that it's going to update the URL, but it's actually just going to send us back to this page with a little bit of an error, and then live server is just going to be like, hey, what's going on? I don't understand that, because that's what forms do. And a form doesn't know how to do anything else. The form is trying to send it. So what we're actually going to do really quickly is that we're going to say that this action should be something else to tell it where to send the form to. So we're going to send it over to our server that we have here at port 3000. And now when we submit this, it's going to say, oh, no, it sent us over there. That's a shame. So what we can do down here is just pass this event through. and it's going to prevent the default behavior of the browser. And now finally when we click, it's going to submit the form, and you're going to see down here my title and hello. This is how forms normally submit to servers. And so I think it submitted earlier too, but I was playing around. And so down here you can see that it's submitting like that. Now what if we wanted this to submit as JSON? Well, let's just pass through JSON true, and now let's submit that again. And when we go over here, you'll see that, bam, automatically formatted for you. And that's all you had to do, is just pass through the event and JSON true, and it's going to prevent the default behavior of the browser and completely serialize the form for you without you having to do anything else. And then what if you forget and you're just working on this submit button? Well, don't worry. The submit button is actually going to go and look at what form it's in and see what action it should send it to, which is that action again. So yeah, just to show you that this is a new one, I'll just do that again, and you can see there's the extra exclamation marks. And then you can really get as personalized as you want to. You can do some crazy stuff with this. Let's see. Let's grab here, because I give you some like event hooks that you can grab into, and you can, like, even if you wanted to completely replace the body, like. I forgot to serialize that. Is that going to be a problem? I forgot to put it inside of JSON. Well. Oh, I forgot the comma there. That broke everything. Whoopsie. There it is. Now we're just going to get hey, which is what I replaced the body with there. But then, you could actually do it with JSON instead, if you think about it, like something like, I don't know, just to make this really obvious and make sure we put the comma there. And now let's submit that. And see, everything's different. And so you can do that with JSON. You can do it with form data. You can pass in the submit. I mean, we're doing this on success thing. We could have done a different on error if we had passed that through for the error we got a minute ago, if that, it hadn't been because of my stupidity. And so there's all of this flexibility, and I'm not even mentioning it all. And let me go ahead and walk you through how the code actually works. We have the send function, which takes the element, the options you pass in, and an apply method so it can work on multiple forms at once. Let's go over to AJAX.js, where we can see that it takes those 3 arguments, and then it has these standard options. And then we have the event. We are just going to say that if you pass through an event, we're going to prevent default. That's the only thing that we're going to do with the send method. You can do whatever you want with the event. I mean, that's up to you, but we're just going to say you can pass it in if you want to prevent the default behavior. And then down here, the URL. So the URL is either going to be whatever you pass in, or it's going to use this getAction function. So whatever you pass in is going to supersede anything else, no matter what the form action is. If you want to use any kind of form action, don't pass in a URL. But if you if you don't pass in a URL, this getAction function will run. And so first, we look to see if the element is inside of a form, it will have a form property. Otherwise, we're going to look to see if we can find a form anywhere upwards in the tree. We're just going to use form as a selector for closest. So if we can find any ancestor form, that's what we're going to use after we first check to see if a form action has been defined and it's not the same as the URL. So what are we looking for here? So the form action is actually going to be what you can define on a button like this, right? And this could be like taking this and going to any other URL for an alternate submission. So let's do other URL and make that really obvious and save that. And now let's make sure that we're working on the button. Yep, so everything here should be fine. And now we're going to send this to the alternate URL because that's going to be the first thing that it checks. So see other URL. So the form action will be the most important thing. But the problem is, if you don't define one, it's going to be defined as the current URL of the page. So this is like a weird edge case. And what I have to do is check to see if it's not the same as window.location.href. So what you can do if you want to use the current URL as an alternate property, but you're defining the URL and you're sending it through this function, what you can do if you don't want to just use the default behavior of the browser is pass through for the URL. You can just pass through like URL like is window location.href, you know, like right, like URL location href, like boom, you're done. So that is the one weird edge case here. And then down here, after we check to see if you passed in a URL or if there is a form action on a button that we're working on, we're going to look to see if we're in a form. We're going to use the action of the form. And if not, then we're going to look to see if we can use that ancestor form. If there's any ancestor forms at all, then we're going to use that. I gotta close this out, I messed up. And then finally, if nothing else, we are going to use the current URL anyways. It's just that it would be superseded by those others if you're not. So that is the case here. And that is how we cover all of those edge cases with this one crazy ternary. I just had that there to help me explain things, but I didn't even read it. And so let's go ahead and save that. And then after we have determined what URL we are sending it to, we next move down and we try to define the body. So you remember, I could define a custom body, and that would supersede anything else. But otherwise, we're going to try to get a body. And that's why it could just automatically send stuff. So if we go down to the getBody function, you'll see that you can also pass through your own custom serializer. And if you're working with a form, or we can find an ancestor form, just like we just did. If we can do either of those, that's probably what's going to get passed through into the form. Otherwise, we are going to just create new form data with that form. And otherwise, if we're in an input or a select or a text area, we're going to use that value. And I guess I can show you that really quickly. So, you know, we could use me. And if we do me as the send right here, then it's going to try to just send the value of that, which will just be this top one, I'm pretty sure. And so, bam, that's the only thing in the body now. It's just using the input's value because I specifically selected that one input. And so moving down from there, we check to see, like I said, if there's an ancestor form. And if nothing else, we can just use arbitrary text content. So let me just like make a div up here, and ID is other, and so down here we can then select it, and then we will say that it's going to send whenever we hit the submit button. And then whenever we click on this now, it's going to say, oh, HTTP error. Oh, it doesn't know what URL to go to because there's no ancestor form. So yeah, I don't have any error events set up. So we can just set up the URL right here, and it's going to go to action now. And now when we submit this, it's going to be other. So yeah, that's how we dynamically determine the URL and the body. And the headers are going to be whatever you pass in. And if you pass in JSON as true, then we're also going to automatically append that is the content type, just to take care of that automatically. And then we move into processing the body. So like if JSON is true, then we're going to check to see if that body that we got from the either the getBody function or whatever you pass in, we're going to check to see if that is form data. If that is form data, then we're
going to go ahead and stringify that with the old object from entries with the body's entries. And then if it's an object, we're just going to go ahead and stringify that, normal JSON stringify, nothing crazy. And if nothing else, we're going to surround it with JSON stringify and put body before it. And that's why the last one you saw here has body other. And then down here, if we keep moving through, you can see that we're just setting up these extra fetch options. And so you have the full request init range of options, because we're just passing this into this wrapped fetch. And come up here and look at how simple this is. We just have the URL, the options, the type, and to one or many. So we can pass in a fallback, and that's going to be displayed in the element. And then down here, we're going to await the response of the fetch with the URL and the options that get passed through. And then we have this handle response. We'll go to that in just a moment. But then the way the onSuccess works is we're leveraging request idle callback. That's still not in Safari, but it's in their technology preview, so I don't feel that guilty about it. And that's just pass the data that we get from await handle response, and we're just going to pass that data through and return the data. And then down here is how we can have a custom error message with .error, and then that is just going to get displayed inside of there. But then you can also run this onError function. So if you can do one or the other, you can just pass through a simple error message, and that's automatically going to get displayed. Or if you don't pass that through and you pass through an onError function, that's what's going to actually run with the wrapped fetch. And so as you can see, that's all we need for send, is we just send that through, and then we get all of these extra options that you can pass through. And that's what the onSuccess is coming from. As you can see, onSuccess was not defined anywhere in send. We're just leveraging this wrapped fetch that I created, and you can see that I can just have all of these extra options that we pass through to each of the things that use fetch, because fetch is incredible, but I just want to offer a few extra things on top of fetch to make it this worth anyone's time. My time, hopefully. It's been like a lot of time. So that is the send method. Let's keep moving. So next up we have do, defer, and from JSON. And these are the first methods where we're going to see where we actually create a new proxy and allow you to use it within a callback function that you pass into the method. So we're going to start off with do because it establishes the concept, and then we'll move on from there. So with do, the idea is that it holds up the entire queue and allows you to do whatever you want with this callback function. And then as soon as you exit the function, you are saying, okay, it's time to move on with the queue. So this allows you to do any kind of like conditional behavior that you want to do, and you can do like any asynchronous stuff that you want to do, and everything will work just fine. You just have to pass it in through the do method, and then it's going to await whatever function that you call on the wrapped element. So it calls this addMethods call with the selector, so it can use it in the context, and with this element that it's going to put into a single array. So what it's going to do with this is it's going to await a function that you call on that wrapped element. So this is a little bit wasteful because you can create quite a few proxies if you do this. I do not recommend doing this on hundreds of elements at once because each one is going to have its own proxy. So what I can do, I've had some experiments where I try to keep working on the same proxy and updating the target, but nothing that I've done, there's been so many edge cases with so many things. I need help in terms of making this more efficient, because this is the only way that I can find where you can use the element inside of a callback function and the whole queue will wait as you return this function. So what you do is you can use it over here, and I'll show you in just a second. But first I want to establish defer before we even talk about do, because defer is exactly like do. Defer and do the exact same thing. It's just about which queue you are placing this in. So do is just going to put it in the main queue, just like everything else.
And the defer queue, so do is just going to call the functions and await the promises inside of it, right? And defer is it's going to await each argument already because of how it works in the deferred queue. Let's go back over there and see where we're getting this defer function from, just to remind you. So back over here in core.js, when we create the queue, we make a deferred queue, but it only ever gets used in this defer function, and that gets returned right here. Almost everything else is going to be in the main queue as we use this add to queue function, and that's what we created with make method. And so as you can see, do and defer, exact same thing. It's just about what queue they go into. So let's go into a little demo to help you understand how this works. All right, so we've got the usual suspects, some buttons and some divs, and we're going to have this async function here that's just going to fetch my profile from GitHub. It's going to get my name. What this fetch data does is it awaits the responses JSON and gets the name out of it. And so when you click on the button, we're going to pass in this callback function, an async callback function. It's not a problem. It will be awaited. And so what we can do is we will say that the text is loading, and we're going to make an artificial wait. And then I'm going to go ahead and fetch it and get the JSON, and then put the data name into the text, turn the color green, await 3 seconds, and then right here with text, we would say this will be green and replace the elements text after 3 seconds, right? So here we can go ahead and do this, and let's go over and check out the do demo. And so when I click it, it's going to have the artificial wait, turn my name green, wait 3 seconds, and then finally the function, the method that runs afterwards, can finally run. So see, we turned it green there, wait, and that happened at the same time that we put the name in, and then we awaited 3 seconds, and then finally put that text up. So no matter how long we await things in here, the queue will always wait for it. And I'm not entirely sure why I set this up like this, because one thing that we can do is just pass this async function over here into this text call. And because we await each argument, it's going to work just fine and show up Jesse Pence, just like it did before. And so let's talk about some other things that you can do with the do method really quickly. So I like this idea down here where I had the fetch dog, and especially this one, yes. So we have fetch dog, right? And it's an async function, and we await the fetch, we get the JSON, and we're going to get this data.message, which is a URL of a dog image. And we're going to set the source of the element that we're working with. And what we do down here when we click on the button is we're going to change the display into an image tag, inside of which we're going to set the source to this fetch call. And that's how cool do is. Look at that. We just pass the function into do, and it's going to know what to do, even though it's an async function. And so let's go back over to a demo. Oh, I forgot to save. We'll save that. Click on this, and a dog image will load in. Oh, it's a little cutie. Hi. And so that is how do works. Now let's talk about defer. So I really like this demo that really help you get the idea of what happens with defer. So defer is helpful for when you want to push something to the very end of the queue and you don't worry about when it executes, but you want to have it operate on whatever the element is at the very end of this chain of methods. So we're going to call defer at the very beginning just to show how well it works. And we're going to say at the end, change the color to blue. And so this text will be black, even though we called that right there. This text will be black. Half a second later, we'll change it to red and say hello world. Half a second later, we're going to do a do call just to show how we can put this in the middle of chains. And we'll get back this JSON.name, and that will come from JSON placeholder. We'll have that there for 2 seconds, and it will be red for those, we'll change the color to green up here inside of a do call. It'll be green for 2 seconds, and then we'll have short and stout right here, and the text will be blue. Okay, and so let's go ahead and go into the defer test, and you can see that half second of glory is black. Then we have hello world, which is red. Leanne Graham is green. And then at the very end, it becomes blue, even though it was the first thing that we called right here at the very end. And so we have this wait call right here. And so let's go ahead and do it one more second, just so you can see. And then one thing I do want to point out, though, is that because this is technically a different queue, you can really get into trouble here. So look, if we put that wait up there, then everything is going to go out of order. Watch this. We're going to refresh, and short and stout and the blue happen first, because this wait call, we're just going to basically disregard what's happening in here. I think it might eventually change. I don't know. But the timeouts are going to throw everything off. So you want to make sure that you don't call any timeouts inside of here if you want things outside to wait on them. Just make sure that you do everything you want to do inside of here, and if you want to wait, just call it at the end. And really, like I said before, these wait calls are really where you get into trouble. So let's go through this really quickly and make this really obvious for you. So if we have this same variable, and we're using this test button, and I got this count, and all we're going to do is we're going to change the text into how many times we clicked. But we have this wait call right here, and then we have a CSS call. So the color will change to red after 2 seconds, but here's the thing. The queue is also blocked that entire time because we're awaiting this promise. You'll see how wait works later, but we're awaiting this promise. So each method is blocking. So if you use the same variable, you're operating on the same queue, and you're making a mistake, a bad mistake. So let's watch how this works really quickly. We'll go over to defer, and so I'm clicking 10 times. I clicked 10 times before the wait call could end. So this can get really infuriating for your user. So the main thing that you want to do, most likely, is just probably call defer, because it makes your life easier. If you ever want to call wait, just wrap it in a defer call, and that lets the internal event loop know that you don't care. You want this on a new, different queue. You want things to still happen afterwards, but not until after this. So if we refresh, you can see we can click this guy as much as we want to, and it will still turn red after 2 seconds. So that is the right way to do things, and that's the main reason defer even exists. But you can also do something that's less good but still better without defer, and that's create a whole different proxy on your event handler. As long as you use a new proxy on each event handler, you're never, ever going to get in trouble. Like, basically, that's the main way you ever get in trouble, just not making a new variable on your event handler. But I mean, you can be careful and use defer and do things the right way and not make too many proxies. It's probably the right way to do it. But I guess either way, you're still making a proxy, aren't you? Because you're making the proxy inside of it. But I would argue that this is probably more coherent right here. So either way, it's nothing in this library is probably that performant. We'll talk more about that later. But still, this is the canonical way of doing things. Just make sure that you put your weights inside of defer calls. And let's move into from JSON. So from JSON is basically do, but we wrap fetch and give you a bunch of event hooks like you saw in send, and we then also give you the element and the JSON, so you can just go ahead and start working on the element with the parsed JSON and not worry about having to do the fetch or any of that. You just say, here's the URL, give me some JSON, let me use a proxy on it. And so, I mean, it's just, honestly, it's pretty cool. I'm really, really proud of how easy and simple this is, where you can just say, okay, here's the URL, give me this data, here's how I'm going to do the templating with that data. You get access to all of the methods, all 43 of the methods, and you get access to these event hooks. So after on success, if you want to run some things on there, you can do it in here, do it in there. This is more for like, like doing like analytics and stuff like that, but you can also use it to manipulate the DOM because it will reflect the DOM after the fetch is finished. So this will as well. But if you wanted to do something that's, separate from the main chain of events, the on success would be the place to do it. But also for analytics and stuff, there's also an on error and a couple other things. But if you just put in an error, it will replace the text content with that. And then we have the on wait right there. So yeah, let's go ahead and check out from JSON right here. And we can see I have this artificial wait, and then you saw the on wait for just a second there before, but now it's been cached. So you could see the waiting for just a second that I put into the text. And then over here, you can see, we just have this templating, title, user ID completed. We can add a class and a different CSS afterwards. You can do whatever you want, and it's going to work just fine. I thought that was pretty cool. One thing that you want to keep in mind is that these calls are almost certainly going to supersede those calls. You can get into some weird data race stuff if you start trying to do some stuff like after the from JSON and then inside of it. Because if you switch to a different element context or something, then it kind of makes sense to do it afterwards in the chain. But don't you want to be working with the data that you're getting from the from JSON call anyways? It's a little annoying how you get this nesting and that your new template is going to be about 3 levels deeper than the new chain is about 3 or 4 levels deeper than the old chain. But just make sure that you don't do too much silly stuff outside of it, because as you can see, that background color is ignored because the sky blue is there. And here's the thing, if you start doing it, you're going to get confused because sometimes it works. But that's, like I said, there's just some weird data race stuff with this library because you have to worry about everything operating concurrently. And so if you just make sure that anytime you do or defer or anything, you just use the chain inside of it instead of doing things like that. So the on success that we talked about, we use request idle callback. So it's going to usually win. Like I showed you, we were trying to change color red there. So the top will be color red, yeah, but then the on success happens and it gets all these P's and it turns them into color green. But yeah, I'm really happy with how from JSON worked. We'll talk more about some of the fetch options maybe later, but let's just move into from stream and from HTML next. We have from HTML and from stream, which is so exciting. So for from HTML, let's go back to the playground for a second. Remember this with the 2 buttons and the 2 divs, and we put the CSS on the buttons, and now when we click on it, it's just going to change what the div on the top does. So we are going to have this from HTML, and what we're going to do is we're just going to change out the body from these 3 boring buttons that are there for no reason to load in that playground, right? So we have that other HTML right here that we want to load into this other page. So let's go up to from HTML here and we load it in, and it worked great, but the event listeners, nothing's there. That's on purpose. Everything is sanitized. Everything will not run. There's no scripts that will ever load into your page unless you want them to. So let's check that out really quickly. So we have a second argument as always, which is going to have all of our, we could do any headers we wanted to or anything like that. But here, what we're going to do is, I guess it's reading that from the other page. But first off, let's just do sanitize false and add in an on success thing here. And you'll see that whenever you have the sanitize false, we could have some extra things in here, but we're still not going to run any scripts that we see unless we pass through run scripts true.
And if we pass through run scripts true, it's going to load in all of the scripts that we had there. And we're going to have a fully functioning HTML page loaded in through JavaScript from another HTML page, which, as most of you should know, is dangerous. So I hide it behind these two options. Sanitize is just going to use setHTML, and then run scripts is going to do a little bit extra to make sure that these scripts actually run and that we can do everything we want to do on the page. So let's go over and look in AJAX. We haven't been in here in a moment. So I cleaned up wrapped fetch a little bit. I realized I lied about how on error. Now on error actually is the only thing that will run if it's set up. Otherwise, we're going to load in an error message, which you can customize, as I said. And then I cleaned everything else up there. Send is just the same as it was. And now we're using this fetch elements function. We're not going to worry about this top part yet. And we're going to go down here to the wrapped fetch, which throws an error if it doesn't find any data. But if it finds some text, it's going to see if it should sanitize it or not, and if it should run any scripts. So we can go down here, and we see that in the handle response, we're getting text because it told it to right there. And then in sanitize or not, it's checking to see if you have passed through sanitizer true and you have your own custom sanitizer. It's the setHTML API again. And as you can see, we just go through the target elements and we run setHTML if you say to sanitize it. And if you say sanitize false, which is going to be, it's not the default, then we use inner HTML. But inner HTML still won't run any scripts. So we have this extra little function here which looks through whatever you just loaded and tries to see if it can find any scripts inside of it, and then it just creates an element for each of them, loads in the content, says it's that type, and replaces the script. That's all you have to do, and then bam, the DOM is like, oh hey, you got some scripts there, okay, let's load those in. And so that's all you have to do to load in some functional HTML. I thought about doing more, but that's all you really have to do. And then where it gets a little more complicated though is when we start streaming things in. So let me get my server set up again and I'll be right back. Okay, so we got from stream here, and as you can see, we check to see if we're looking for a server sent event or a normal stream. And then we run this fetch elements over here. And so let's look at the server that I set up. First, we're going to do server sent events because you already saw some of that code. So look, we're just setting up an event stream and telling it to keep the connection alive. And then we're sending the current time every second, right? And then over here on from stream, all I have to do to set that up is say what URL I'm looking at, and then that it's a server sent event, right? So we have server sent event true, and we're looking at that URL, and we get the current time over and over and over. And so that's every time it sends that, but we can also send in some hooks. We have all of our same hooks that we normally have here. We have like on success and on error. So every time it succeeds, we'll add on it worked. But what if you're trying to actually stream something in with a server sent event and you're trying to stream something in over time? What you can do with that is you can say add it on to the end instead of erasing it every time. And then that's going to keep adding it on like that. I'm still not sure if this is the optimal way to do it, especially with the attachment happening every time there at the bottom. But it does show you that you have a little bit of power and a little bit of configuration for how small this is actually going to be. You'll see how silly and small this is. But what about a normal stream? Let me set up that server really quickly. Okay, we got the server set back up. We are just doing the same old core stuff. This time we're doing an octet stream. And every node server can just stream by default. Whenever you do res.write, you can just set up a stream. So over the course of 5 seconds, we're just going to keep on writing res.write the time and say hello in the console. And then at the end of 5 seconds, we'll finish that up. And then so over here, this is the standard. This is all we have to do. We just say what URL and then from stream. And then this should just work perfectly. And it already did in the background, but here you can see it in action. Loading in, streaming live data. But if you look in the console, you'll see it's not saying hello. That's because we are automatically sanitizing this by default. So I'm going to go ahead and let it do its thing. And so here the thing is, it's not going to be running the scripts until the very end. And that's, man, I had some attempts that were mostly working, but like deduping the scripts over time until I could actually bring it in at the end. You'll see how simple the code is now, and I was having to do some crazy stuff to do anything other than just loading the scripts in at the end. And I mean, do you really want to be running all these scripts while you're trying to load in your HTML? No, just load your HTML in first, and then you can load the scripts in afterwards. And so that's the thing. But by default, it's going to be sanitizing it, and it will not run any scripts. So let's go over into AJAX and see how all the streaming stuff works. So if we go back up, we can go into the wrapped fetch, and you can see this is all just going to work normal, but it's the handle response where we're going to be doing the actual work here. And if we go back into the method, you can see that we just go in and we call fetch elements and pass in the type if it's a server sent event or if it is a stream. And so down here in fetch elements, we have all the server sent event stuff there at the very top, where we just check out the event source at the URL, and then we wait for some events, and every time we get a message, if it's add, we add it on, and if it's not, then we're going to completely replace the element with the sanitize or not function, which we can look at again in a second. You already saw it for the HTML though. And then down here is where we run the onSuccess function for whenever we're doing a server sent event, and this is where we can run scripts if we need to for a server sent event if you send some HTML that has some scripts in it. I didn't show that though. And then down here in wrapped fetch, this is exactly the same except we're passing through the type. And that's going to be hitting it here. It's not going to be text. It's just going to be checking if it should run a script, because the stream actually gets handled, like I said, in wrapped fetch by itself. We are just taking the data at the end and seeing if we should run the script. But whenever we are actually handling the response, we're getting the reader from the response body and running this recursive read function with the reader, which just takes the read function and takes the promise that it gets from it, checks the done and value properties that you get from the promise, and we use this text decoder, and then we just collect all the chunks, and then we sanitize it as we bring it in, and then when all the chunks are done, we return those. And then down here we have the sanitize function. And so some of what I was thinking about doing was putting the run scripts function inside of sanitize and having it run together. But like I said, I was having trouble with deduping, and then it was all running at the end anyways. And so like when you had it in sanitize or not, you're going to be running run scripts each time. So you have to keep a reference to the value of the scripts outside of it. And then you have to make sure that the content of a script you're bringing in each time isn't the same as the script you had before. Or what if you do want to run the same scripts multiple times? There's all these edge cases where instead what I'm just wanting to do, and it's so much simpler, is just waiting until this is done, and then we are finishing it up and just joining the chunks and bringing back the value. And in that case, afterwards, I can just wait, and that is whenever I run, where am I? Oh, I'm in fetch elements. That's whenever I run the run scripts function. And I don't know, it just worked better for the simpler code. And I don't know, I this is part of why I reserve. I'm okay to go up to 4 kilobytes. That's my new maximum, but it's just to be able to handle this stuff better. I would like for this stuff to work better. So if you guys could help me out, if you've watched this far and you're interested, please, if you have some cool ideas, let me know. Let's keep moving into the end of the methods though. That was from stream. Next up, we have transition and wait. So transition is just a thin wrapper around the web animation API, which is just fantastic. And it gives you this promise with every animation.finished. You get the animation object that you get back from the web animation API, and that tells you when the promise is finished. But what if you have all of these elements and they're all having these promises that resolve? So I have to wrap it in a promise.all and make sure that I go through the entire array and that all of the promises resolve before we move through the queue. That's the whole idea, is that it holds up the queue for as long as you need to do these things in between. And usually it's going to mostly be like animations, and the Web Animations API is so incredible that I don't really need to do a dang thing. I just wanted to wrap it behind this queue system and allow you to use it in the middle of the queue. Because let me go down here to transition really quickly, because whenever I hover over this, I'll show you. I give you all of these like options that are just the actual options of the Web Animations API. You can either pass in an object or pass in an array full of objects that are going to each be the keyframes. And like, it's really, really easy to work with. It's just a little bit unapproachable because you see these giant objects, but once you actually take a look at them, they're really easy to work with. So transitions are really, really cool once you start to work with it. I was going to do more to like give you like show and hide and toggle and all that stuff, but like it's so easy to just build those keyframes and reuse them over and over, that I would rather just give you the transition function and let you learn how to use this awesome Web Animation API. And the whole idea is that you just have to wrap these things behind a promise. The same thing with wait. Like, this is the normal wait function, but we need to have this promise and await the resolving of the promise to make sure that we can hold up the queue. But that's how transition and wait works. So let's go over to this double cache is the one I think it is. Yeah. So up here you can see that we can just set up like these keyframes and options and reuse them over and over. But I just wanted to use it this one time, but just show you how cool and simple this can look when you just say transition with these keyframes and options. I mean, that's so easy and so cool. So these are going to come in from -100 pixels and 0 opacity, and then come to where they're supposed to be in the DOM with full opacity. And with the options, it's going to take 4 seconds, ease in and out, and fill in forwards. So we have these divs that say hello at first, and then we start transitioning them, and then we fetch the data after the transition is done. So it's going to say hello until the transition is done, and then it's going to fetch the data. Then we're going to wait 2 seconds, and then we're going to remove them from the DOM. And you can see down here that fetch data is an async function, and we don't have to await it. We're just going to put it in, and so the animations will fully finish for the 4 seconds it will take. Then we'll fetch the data, then we'll wait 2 seconds, and then we'll remove them from the DOM. And then down here, we just have some more stuff where it's just like doing some silly animations and saying, hey, I'm changing over time. And then over here, I just do a bunch of more silly stuff. I don't know. I was just trying to show you that each one is going to have its own queue, but they're all going to be operating concurrently. Each thing will be operating at the same time. So you can see as these come down saying hello, before they fetch, then the 2 seconds later they're removed. Everything else is happening at the same time. These queues don't worry about these queues, and they don't worry about these queues. All of these things have their own life cycles, and that's the whole point of this. And I know that I've been harping on about all the problems, but this by itself is so cool. Look, you have these animations, and then you have the async await, and then you have the wait, and then you remove each and every one of these divs, which there's 4 of them. These are all independent divs that we're operating on. They could be anywhere at the DOM, and they would all be doing the exact same thing, and you only had to define it once in these 5 lines of code. All right, I just keep rambling there for a bit. Let's just move into the context switching methods. So let's do the simplest ones first, the ones that use this context switch method. Next, previous, first, last, and parent. And they all really establish the simple concept that all the other context switching functions use. So as you can see, we're just going to pass in this DOM property. Next element sibling for next, previous element sibling for previous, parent element for parent, etc., etc. And let's go all the way down here and see what context switch is doing. So if we look at context switch, you can see just like make method, it's queuing up a function. And what that function is going to do is it's going to make an array of result elements. And we are going to make that array by using the filter method on everything in the array, right? So we go through and we map through and we use the action of the filter array method on each element, and we are using the prop that we passed through at the top. Remember, next element sibling, previous element sibling. So we use this function so that we don't have to keep redefining this each time, because it's different than make method, because we want to do this switch target at the end. So up here at switch target, you can see this is where the fixed property or the fixed argument finally actually has an effect. Remember at the very beginning up here, fixed equals false, we pass that through from the core whenever we did the dollar or double dollar signs function call. It'll be false unless you set it to true. So if the second argument is true, then you cannot switch the target. And so if the fixed argument was not set, or it was set to false for some reason, then we will keep moving on, and we will then set the target to now it be the new target unless the length was 0, because it's completely null. We want to make sure we at least have some kind of array to work with, just in case, so we don't throw any like silly errors, just because you might be emptying out the array intentionally from a take while or something like that we'll talk about later. And so here you can see that we now use the update proxy function again, make a new proxy, return that proxy. And so at the very end, we will then be having the new proxy as the one that we will be referring to for all of our methods that use queue function in the future, because remember that the second argument to queue function here, when we created it, the queueAndReturn, was the function that returned the proxy. So that's where that comes in. When we switch the target, we want to have a fresh reference to the proxy. So we have that getProxy call in every single method that we call. So this way we have the correct context. Whenever we do this get proxy, each time we are going to have the right context for the functions that get queued in the future. And so let's go into a simple demo. Okay, so this is the simplest, best example to show you the power and how confusing that this can be. So you have these two buttons, ID counter, and one that says I am not that button. And so we're saying that we have this counter button that when you click on it, it's going to be the same thing we've been doing, just iterate the count inside of it. And then we're going to set some CSS on the counter. And then we're going to move into the next element and switch the element context of the proxy that we're working on, which we're still calling counter. This is getting weird. But we're going to change that CSS to light blue. So as you can see, everything works great. This is not that button. But as you might have gotten a hint at from that, wait a minute, that variable that we used in here was counter. But we just switched the element context of counter. So when the function gets queued with that context, then that's not going to work because we set the onClick handler to the counter, but when it updates the button, it thinks it's in that button because the last context it had was this next. And so this is why the fixed argument is there. It makes things a lot less confusing whenever you just set it in stone. Once again, all you have to do to fix this is just boom, 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 and we set up a new variable, new queue, everything works great. And it's not that hard to do, but it's so handy to be able to switch the context. And so I don't want to remove this power because you can do some crazy stuff, like, just keep switching the context out and no problem at all. So I think back here, a little bit back here, with here, we can move up through the parent multiple times, and you can see that we have set up CSS on each of these elements as we iterated through. And then we could even go back down and we could pick that counter back out and go back into the counter. And when we have it like this, we are going to be affecting the counter's text for sure because we picked the counter again. And so, I mean, you can fix it whenever you set up this weird stuff and you want to do everything in the same chain with the same variable, but it can also get you into trouble. So let's keep moving on and we'll talk about the other context switching before we finish up. So you already saw me use pick to get that counter back, and so the other 5 are ancestor, which uses the closest API, which just lets you put a selector in, and it's going to find the closest thing up in the tree that matches that selector. And so this way you can just use on one element or many elements at once, whatever is held within the proxy, and that is the ancestor one. And so you can see these are very similar to context switch, but it's not exactly the same because we're not using that property. What we're using is a method, and these are just like going through into the arrays, like kids is my wrapper around children, and siblings, just make sure that we're not bringing back the element itself. We're just getting all the other children from the parent. And so like these are kind of like, you know, my silly things. Like as always, like I'm not trying to replace closest. I'm trying to give you a different thing that you can use, and that's why they all have very similar but different names. But these are all pretty much, I already talked about how filter target and switch target works, and like these are all very, very similar. The thing is, like with pick and pick all, these just filter the target down to match a selector down in the tree, and so pick is going to just use a query selector on your target that you have for each of those elements, and then switch your target to those elements, and then pick all is going to use a query selector all, and that's how those two work. So like pick all, it's query selector all, ancestor it's closest, kids it's basically children, and siblings it's filtering out the parent element's children for everything except for the current element. And so then that is those, and that's most of the context switching. But then I went crazy while I was making this video and made some new conditional APIs here with if and take while, which we'll move into next. So folks, I broke a promise to myself and I added more methods. We're at 43 now. And so here we are here in each argument, and I made it so that we're going to watch out and not await each argument, so we can actually do some conditional logic through the middle of a chain. And like the idea of doing it just like came to me this morning, and I just like had to do it. It's like so what we do is that we actually make a new proxy for each one. So you probably don't want to do this for like thousands of items in the DOM, but you can do some cool stuff here. And so we have the if function, which waits to see if a conditional, if like a predicate function returns a boolean that's true. If that's the case, then we're going to run the then function. Otherwise, we will run the OR function, and we're doing it for each item in the array of the target. And so what we have down here is the take while function, which is actually going to operate on the elements of the DOM, and you can push in a predicate and check on the elements. So the idea was, before you could conditionally do the logic with all of the DOM APIs, you could check text content, check out the style, check out the classes. You could do all of that already with the DOM APIs. And I was saying that all of my stuff is setters, and and you can use all of that for getters. And that's still the case, but this makes it so much easier to do conditional logic based off of those DOM API checks. And so I really just wanted to make it easier, and like, man, just especially like take while, I thought about how cool it could be to do stuff with this, and I'll show you in just a second. But the thing is, especially with like take while and stuff like this, and it was already the case with the other context switching, I've said it several times, is that things can get really confusing. And I also just thought of this morning, where you can just refresh and take the target back
to the original target. So after you've done a bunch of context switching, you can go back, and so we're going to save in the original target. So here we have our if test, and we're going to have a couple buttons here just for the sake of doing a couple of them while we can. And down here you're going to see that we're going to check, and we're going to see if the count is correct for that, then we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. So it'll be green whenever it is even, and it will be red when it is odd. And that's how it works. It's a boolean that you return from is, and if it's true it runs then, if it's false it runs or. Very simple, but very, very powerful when you think about how it's going to operate on it, where it is at that time in the chain. And then afterwards, we're going to be able to run the CSS that's going to operate off the count dynamically as well, and they will both be working at the same time. So let's go ahead and go up to here to if. And in here, if we click, you'll see that they both update dynamically based on what is happening with the element at that moment in time. And so that is the power of if. And now let's go down to take while really quickly. And like I said, the beauty of if is that it operates on each individual element in the collection. And so look, we can check to see the text content of every individual element and say how we're going to operate on each individual one. And then we're going to put the border around it. We could do some more conditional logic below there, and it would operate on each single one. And you can see that the even ones are yellow and the odd ones are pink. And that is because of this if statement right here, based off of this is boolean right here. And so that's the beauty of the if block. I just had to do it. I had to break my rules. And then next up, let's check out take while. So we're going to have take while up here, and we're going to be operating on these numbers as well. Let's make this a lot less complex for right now. And so you're going to see that we're going to take while the text content is under 5. And so we're going to limit the proxy collection to only those items from that point on. So only then to those items will the background color apply. So if we go over here, you'll see it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 do not have the background color applied. And when we console log the text content of each element in the collection with do, you can see we get 1, 2, 3, 4. And so that's also one of the things that you can see here, that do is going to operate on each element in the collection the same way. So if you do any like conditional logic inside of do, it's going to operate on each element in the collection. Whereas as you just saw with if, it's going to operate on each element in the collection individually. And so if you need to do, it's part of why I did if in the end, because you can do this like grand scale conditional logic with do, but if you want to operate on each individual thing in the collection, if is the only real way to do it very easily, other than mapping over it or filtering through it. And that's the same case with take while. You can do this with a filter, but being able to put that in the middle of your chain and then being able to conditionally operate after that, it's like pretty powerful actually. But the problem is, like with everything else, it got super duper confusing. So I brought in this refresh method. And so the idea is after we do that, we're going to refresh it and now have all of the spans again. So all of the spans will have the solid black border, but only the first 4 will be highlighted because we did the take while method beforehand. And so I actually wanted 42 methods in honor of Douglas Adams. So I might make move or clone into one method, but I don't know. Like, they're all my children. I don't want to kill any of them. So as of right now, we have 43 methods. And refresh is really the game changer here, because with this next finale demo that I'm about to show you, it's going to be kind of handy if you are lazy and you never switch variables.
Okay, I originally recorded things out of order. I think it makes way more sense to move into the error handler and promisify first, and then we'll do the weird, crazy demo that has a bunch of stuff happening at the very end before the conclusion. So let's move into the error handler.
Okay, so first up we have the error handling, and as you can see, it doesn't take much, just 20 lines of code. But the key is that we pass this give context function over into all of the areas where we could have any errors, and that's what really just makes the error handling really nice. And so our default error handler just passes the error and the context into the console, and I put the context first because it looks better, but most people are going to expect the error to be first, so I just went ahead and did that. It's not confusing as long as you don't look at mine, because when you set up yours, just know that you have an error that you could do for anything, and you can pass it to any function you want, and it will replace this. And if you want more context, especially if you use the promisify function, then you're going to need to pass in a second argument. And so down here, if we look at give context a little bit closer, you can see that the main thing it does is to describe which method that you're calling something on, because that's most likely where your error is going to be. But if you're just really confused and you just can't even find an element with that selector when you're setting up the variable, we also pass it through at the very, very beginning back here in core. And you can see here we're returning the error handler with the new error, no elements. So let's go over to this test over here, and you can see errors.html. If we try to query a non-existent div, we're not setting up any HTML or anything, we're just doing something silly. If we try to do that, we are going to get this nice error over here that tells us the context first, and then we get the error stack underneath of it. And then you can see that if we pull that down, we have the full thing, but it tells us everything we need to know at the very top. And then here, you can also customize your error handler, and it really is just as simple as passing in something like this. So you can see that we are just passing in the error as the first argument, context is the second argument, and then we can do whatever we want to. We're just going to put it into the DOM like that, and then when we query the non-existent div, we get the error, which we throw, and then the context, which is right there. And so then also, if we were to do anything on a method, then we're going to get that instead. And man, I'm really struggling. And so then we save that, and then you can see that we're going to get the actual error down here. We're not going to get the actual stack because we're just putting the string into the HTML, but we're going to see some more advanced error handling in just a moment. Next up, we have promisify. So the idea behind this is that there's all these like old callback-based APIs like XHR, IndexedDB, and the geolocation API, all this kind of stuff, where it's really handy to be able to convert it into a promise, so you could be able to stick it in the middle of these queues that you can make with this. And so the idea of a promisify function is that it does it for you. It just magically does it. So the first argument is a function that you want to promisify, and the second argument is a meta object, which can contain a timeout property. That's the only actually defined property, and it already has a default setting of 5 seconds. So you don't have to define the meta object at all. You can just pass in a function if you're fine with 5 seconds being how long you're willing to wait before moving on with the queue. So the idea is that we just wait to see if it's settled, and you can pass in a resolve and reject function just like a normal promise. And then if 5 seconds you don't call one of those two functions, we're going to automatically reject it. And then so what we're going to pass in here, the error handler is going to automatically catch all of our promise rejections already, and so we have that down here. And so inside, we're going to catch anything happening in the function as well, and try to catch any of those errors as well. And so we're going to try and catch it, and we're going to try to catch any promise rejections. And so this is going to really give you a whole kind of like backing of security. And so we have this meta object that we pass through that you can use in the error handler. So this all sounds really abstract, but let's go see how you can adapt XHR with the promisify function. So with this fetch API function, we just make a new async function with resolve and reject, and we're going to make it take 1 second so you can see what the timeout error looks like. And then down here, you can see we're just getting a to-do from JSON placeholder. And then we have a normal XHRBS, which I am glad we don't deal with anymore. And then down here is the meta object. So I'm passing in a really short timeout. We're only willing to wait a half a second. But I'm also passing in the URL and the function name, because this is just going to become an anonymous function up here. So what we need, if you need any more details for the errors at all, you want to pass this stuff through so you can actually know what happened whenever you pass it through to your error handler. And so this error handler is going to dump it in the DOM again. We're going to cast the magic spell required for JSON stringify to look decent when you put it in the DOM. And then down here, we're going to wait a half a second and say that we're about to do it. And then it's going to time out because we're only waiting a half a second. But then up here, we have a fake 1 second wait. So in here, we're going to go ahead and do the fetch data, and you'll see that the error automatically gets pushed into the DOM because that's what our error handler is telling it to do. And it has all of this wonderful metadata that we can have about whatever function was just causing the error in the middle of our chain. And so we can still hide this from the user. It doesn't have to affect their experience, but then we'll still know about it behind the scenes and have all of this extra information about whatever happened with the XHR request. And so we can also have the XHR on error in there. And I've got a bunch of more examples showing you like how the try catch is caught and everything like that. So we have a successful fetch just so you can see that it works fine. And then over here, we're going to have a network error. This is still going to show up over here, and but we can at least get that set up down there because that's just you messing up, but at least you're going to know where you messed up. And then over here, we're going to have the timeout error. We already saw that. And then a thrown error inside of the function, we can still get our metadata. And let me show you where that thrown error is so you can see how nice it is. Like, it's literally, even if you just throw an error, it's still, the rejection won't be reached, but we're going to get the metadata no matter what. And so that's the timeout actually right there. I might have to optimize that, but anyways, hopefully people won't just be throwing errors like that and it would actually reach the rejection. And so that's how the permisify function works. It's really, really simple, but as you can see, audio API, canvas, the request animation frame. I have a bunch of examples here showing you how you can use it, and you can do things like pass it automatically into the do function, and that's going to work just fine. Let me show you the request animation frame one because that's pretty cool. Because what we have here is we're going to wait for a second and then do the animation. And so what you can see here, 2 second wait, yellow at the start, do, move box. Isn't that awesome? You just use permisify and the do function together, and you can have all of this backing logic. You can pass in some metadata, say how long you're willing to wait for it to do that, and then at the end, after everything has happened, you know it's not going to turn green until that permisify function resolves. And so pretty cool, right? I think the permisify thing is actually a lot better than I thought it was going to be with how promise-based this whole API is. So I realized it was basically impossible to clear an interval correctly the way I had permisify set up before. So I decided to build it into it. So now the meta object expects two properties, timeout and interval. But just like timeout, if you do not pass it, everything will still work correctly. It just will not set an interval because it's just looking to see if interval is truthy. If you pass a number, it'll be truthy. And we will set the interval, and that will run this run function that we set up here. And so that just has the try catch inside of it. And we pass clean up to run, reject, and resolve. And then this way we can have this really clean looking thing and have reject right down here in the set timeout. And we can just have that same thing together and have that centralized logic. And I was able to build set interval into it and still have it all under 50 lines of code. So let's go look at this demo over here that I made with set interval. And the idea behind this is that we are just going to be oh, yeah, I just wanted it to be as obvious as possible. So it's just going to console log polling, and that's going to be our interval function. We're going to pass that into permisify, and we're going to say after 3 seconds, you're going to time out,
but you're going to be running that function every 100 milliseconds until that timeout runs. And if it resolves, then we will clear both the timeout and the interval, right? So let's go into the demo. And if we go into the console, you'll see that this will pull 30 times for 3 seconds, and then the timeout will happen, and we will get the meta object passed to the error. All right, let's move into the finale. So here we are in the grand finale demo. I call it the perils await. And so as you can see here, it's just, I have a single div I call app, and I'm filling it up with a bunch of HTML, and then we're operating on that HTML afterwards. I'm kind of like cheekily saying it's kind of like React or something, and I'm just bringing in all the stuff I'm going to work on. And so we have this counter here. We've been doing that often. We also are grabbing the container, which is at the very top. And you can see we have this random color function, and every time we click on the container, it's supposed to be changing the container's background color, but oh goodness gracious, what is all of this? And so I think that I accidentally, yes, from the last take, already have the way to fix everything here at the back. But I just want to show how confusing things get whenever you refuse to create a new variable. This is how you get into trouble in this library entirely, because who knows what I'm going to be clicking on here, and also all of these wait calls are going to make it not even work correctly at first. So if we go back over here and we refresh, we're going to click on the container, but I mean, I think that something there changed colors. Who knows what I'm inside of now? Oh, it ended up down here. And so, like, that's how you get into trouble. And so over here, we're going to go ahead and hit the refresh at the end. And so it's still going to move through all of the other craziness as the wait calls are happening. But then it's going to end up at the very back right there. And so if we pull that out, and let's go into perils fixed or not. So we're going to go into this perils fixed or not over here, because I'm going to show how the defer function is going to make things a lot more simple. Because look, we're clicking on the container and we're changing the color of something. And so let me show you the reason why this is happening. So it's because when we call the defer call, it's going to be pushed down into the queue at the moment that you call it. So wherever we ended up beforehand, which just happened to be the button because I wanted to make it not confusing because we have all this craziness happening beforehand. But because we call defer when the button is the last thing before the defer call, that's what's going to be held inside. So while you can interact, and this is what's going to make things a lot easier to deal with in terms of having the same variable in some ways, it's also going to make things confusing because this element and these elements have different queues as well. And so each time you're pulling yourself into a different queue and you have all of this nesting, and again, everything is fixed if you just make a new variable. So that is my grand finale demo. I'm going to move into a conclusion now. Really quickly, I built this crazy flowchart, so I just want to walk through it really fast with you guys, okay? So as you can see up here, we have the green, which is the function call. That is the $, over $. That's where we get the selector and whether or not it is fixed. And inside we define the type. And with that, we call createProxy from the core. Then we build an addMethods call, which immediately gets createQueue from the core, and that's where it gets addToQueue and defer. Defer immediately goes into the defer method. We saw that. Otherwise, everything else gets added to the addToQueue argument, and that is where we get queueAndReturn from core.js. And with queueAndReturn, that gets the most recent version of the proxy and addToQueue, and it creates the queue function, which we use in make method on all of the rest of the methods. Otherwise, addMethods is just determined on the type and the selector to see how we're going to treat the target, and we're going to see how it's going to operate, how it will map and then do the action with each of the args for all of those elements in the array, which will be when we call each of the methods. And we use handlerMaker to use the update proxy function, which is how we're going to get the most recent version of the proxy for each function that we queue and return the proxy from, so we can chain them. And then update proxy gets called by switch target. And the only thing that can affect switch target other than that is whether or not it was fixed at the very beginning whenever you called the $ or the $. And that is how everything works. And the error handling is almost all through queueAndReturn, because you can set the error handler that is going to be passed into queueAndReturn, as well as promisify, which is not here. But then also we give context to every method right here with the give context function, which is called in make method, and it's also called in createProxy, but that arrow would make everything messy, and that's how we get our internal queue for every variable. Also, if you have watched this far and you're curious about my React Server Components content, I am working on it, I swear. I have so much done, I promise. It will be done someday. Here we are in bundle.js with the final version of the app at the end of the video at 2.3.5, and you can see we're at 3.69 kilobytes, 8.72 kilobytes before gzip, and so that's still 10 times smaller than jQuery before gzip, but about 9 times smaller after gzip. And so the and then we still have Droxy, which doesn't have any of those other methods, and that was at 1.9 kilobytes. But it can do everything. As you saw, the do method is extremely capable, and it will hold up the chain, now that I fixed it, until the promise, whatever you put inside, is finished. So at 1.9 kilobytes, you can use that, or you can use the 43 methods. I still want it to be 42, but as of right now, it's 43 methods that I fit into 3.69 kilobytes. Now, do I think that just because it's small, that makes it good? No. Do I think because it's small, that will make it fast and efficient and performant? Also, definitely not, because as you saw in here, I was not hesitant to create new proxies. Every time we call this addMethods call, that's a new proxy, and especially with that crazy if conditional that I added at the end. I mean, if a new proxy for every single one, like I said, if that was thousands of elements, that would like slow the thing down to a crawl, almost certainly. And so it's one of those things where I would love to refactor this and do everything like on the prototype, or do something like where all the functions return this and we can do the chaining that way. Believe me, I've thought about all the alternatives, but like nothing has let me be so like insanely like concise with this code. It's still only like 750 lines of code, and we get something, I mean, that's crazy 43 methods. Like, and they're nothing. From stream, from server sent event, you can do the from JSON, and even though I still haven't fixed it waiting on it in the chain, you start a whole new chain inside of it. So that's only one level of nesting, and then you have the JSON to manipulate the data as you wish inside of it. And I mean, you can do like this destructuring, you can do some templating inside of it, like I said earlier. Oh, I'm not showing it, but like, yeah, so you can see, and like with the on success, the fallback, I even added one just now, which was on wait. I forgot to mention that to you guys. So now there's a timeout, and you can set the amount of time, and you can have an on wait callback that you could put a message, so you can wait to put up a loading message on the screen until 250 milliseconds is the default. And so like, I don't want to waste any more time. We're at like 2.5 hours. You can go try it out for yourself. But as you can see, I still have all these ideas to make this even cooler. So like, I think that for me personally, it's probably going to be a 5 kilobyte limit for jQuery, and I would love to make it performant. I would love to drop the proxies entirely if I could, and we could leave that in Droxy and leave it as its own thing and make jQuery even better, because I mean, like, it's so many cool features in such a small package. Like,
I am pretty proud of it. I've spent a lot of time on it, way too much time. So that's why I made this whole thing chronicling this adventure. It's been an emotional journey if you've stuck with me to this point, so I appreciate that. Thank you for watching this. If you have, I can't believe it, you did. I mean, it's a pretty cool code, right? Like, if you have any ideas, please let me know. Please, I am open for contributions, for pull requests, open some issues, play with the library, find out all the stuff I screwed up, because if nothing else, like I said, I want to cover the edge cases and stuff like that with this like 5 kilobyte limit that I've set for myself, and we could do like a bunch of cool more other features with that too. So if you have any ideas, just let me know, because I want to do more stuff with this library. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.